this morning at 9 o'clock we have already sent you by electronic email. I think an email is always electronic, okay, but nevertheless. I'm a lawyer, so I'm not so specialized in these things, but we have sent you by email the first draft of a counterterrorism action plan that has been also discussed already in the bureau of the group yesterday evening. And the purpose of our work of today, of this conference, is mainly to listen and to discuss with three experts on what could be the essential building blocks of such a counterterrorism action plan. And we're gonna formalize the action plan then later on in the next group meeting on the 3rd of February, based on the discussion and the information we have gathered today. But before going to the order of the day, I would like to make a political remark on the outcome of the Greek election and to tell you that about this Greek election. The good news is certainly that for the first time in 40 years, Greece will not be run by the two traditional parties, by Nea Demokratia and by PASOK, and that the Greeks have clearly made the choice for an alternative. However, what Syriza is going to do with their victory, well, is not so very positive, because the choice of their coalition partner, the independent Greeks, is worrying, because it's a downright anti-migrant, homophobic and anti-Semitic party with whom they have made this coalition. Only a few facts. The new defense minister, Panos Kamenos, attacked in a few months ago in December the Jewish community in Greece and the Muslim community by saying that they don't pay taxes, what is a kind of rhetoric we heard between the two world wars. Members of parliament of the independent Greeks are always referring to a so-called world Zionist complot against Greece. And moreover, this party, the Independent Greeks, is a party who want to establish a 2.5% quota for non-Greek population residing in the country, what means a mass expulsion of immigrants if they succeed. You know that we have supported in Greece Topotami, because our party Draghi was supporting and got a number of candidates on the Topotami list. It's a pro-European party who want reforms, and the reality is that it's not a coalition bound in anti-European populism that shall solve the problems of Greece. It's by in-depth reforms, structural reforms in Greece, that Greece can emerge from the crisis. So I wanted to give you this statement because it's absolutely clear that our group has closely to follow the developments in Greece, what this new coalition shall do, and also to be ready to criticize it if it is necessary. And the first step that Syriza has done was certainly not one we welcome. On the contrary. But now let's go to the order of the day, a plan to tackle terrorism and jihadism in Europe. As you know, after the 9/11 attacks in New York, we have used that momentum at that time, in 2001, to launch a very substantial anti-terrorism package in 2001. In total, but Mr. Kerkhoven can correct me, I think there were 79 initiatives that were launched in September, October, November of 2001, and the most important of that package at that time was the European arrest warrant. It has taken at that moment 5 months or something like that to. But it was a short period. In 5 months, the European arrest warrant was a short period if you compare it with the 15 years of discussion before that on the European arrest warrant. And I think that as has happened on 9/11, after the Paris attacks, the European Union is again at a turning point, and that we have to use this momentum to further strengthen our internal security policy on a European level. That is at stake. And the challenges are clear. We need to reconcile more security with the protection of the rights and freedoms, which are the founding principles of our union. We need to tackle terrorist activities and to fight against radicalized networks, knowing that these criminals have no national borders, and also knowing that most of them are European citizens born and educated within the European Union. And I think that the third challenge before us is also we need to work on the root causes of jihadism and radicalization. And that is also a huge task for the coming years. We know that the European Commission is working on a global plan, and the idea of this conference is that we come forward today with a first package of proposal to contribute to this action plan in a constructive way. And I'm not going to repeat this paper that has been sent to you this morning already with all these proposals. We shall continue to work and discuss on that today and next week. But a main concern of our group is that if you look to all the major terrorist attacks over the past 10 years, then we see that the perpetrators were known by several intelligence services and sometimes also directly by most law enforcement authorities due from time to time to previous sentences. So the problem seems to us not so much data collection, but the sharing of the information, the linking of existing intelligence, the common risk assessment in the Union. Because it's obvious if you have a Schengen area, you need also common instruments. It's a little bit like the euro. We have the euro, and then we got problems with the euro because we didn't create a common economic governance in the eurozone. Well, if you have a Schengen, the Schengen is like a euro. It's an enormous step forward in European integration, but that you need also to have the necessary tools, common tools. And we think that that one of the first things to do is to upgrade the EU Intelligence Analysis Center, INCEN, to a real Eurintell, where we share all the intelligence between member states, and that on a mandatory basis and not on a voluntary basis. But there are certainly a lot of other things to do. So that said, I hand it over now to Sophie in 't Veld, who is responsible in our group, you know, for this policy area. She shall share this ALDE conference, and I want already to thank our experts to be ready to discuss with us these different proposals. Sophie.
Yeah, thank you, Guy, and good morning, everybody. I would like to start by thanking our three speakers of today, not only for being here and for sharing their thoughts with us, but also for accepting our invitation at such short notice, because we decided, of course, very recently to have this seminar because it's such an important and topical subject. I'm going to introduce the panelists and invite them to do a short presentation. After that, I will present the ideas in the draft paper that this group will hopefully adopt next week. We've already had a first round of debate last night. And then we will open the floor for questions and debate. So I'm very pleased to have on the podium, first of all, Mr. Gilles de Kerkhoven, the EU Counterterrorism coordinator. One of your predecessors was actually a prominent liberal, Mr. Gijs de Vries, former president of this group in a grey past. And you are, of course, very prominent in the debate currently and certainly after the tragic events in Paris. So we're very pleased to have you on the podium. On the far left, Mrs. Quirine Eijkman, who's a researcher at the Center for Terrorism and Counterterrorism at Leiden University. So we're very pleased to have you here and hear your perspective. And finally, Mrs. Verity Harding, who's public policy manager at Google. And you may wonder why Google, but it is very clear that companies like Google and other internet-based companies are increasingly used as a tool or a platform for security policies. So I'm going to invite you to speak in that order. So Mr. Gilles de Kerkhoven, you have the floor.
Thanks a lot, Sophie. Thank you, Mr. Verhofstadt, for inviting me. I'm very happy that you are preparing an action plan and try to feed the EU policy, because it is very useful to have several input, and I'm sure that it will help us a lot to think forward and make additional progress into the EU integration. I remember, because I was at the time in charge of Justice in Home Affairs in the Council, the day after 9/11, it started with a call. You were in Kazakhstan, I think, by Kazakhstan. We were ambassador, and in 1 second, Prime Minister Verhofstadt, who was the president of the European Council, decided to hold a European extraordinary meeting of the European Council, which was the start of 6 months of intense work. And as he has said, I've never seen progress achieved so quickly. Frankly, the European arrest warrant is really a revolution in terms of, I would say, sharing of sovereignty. It amounts to what we did with the currency. Instead of having 28 extradition, very cumbersome procedure, it was replaced by one single arrest warrant. And the consequence is that one of the authors of the London bombings was moved from Rome to London in 42 days, while in the past, sometimes we had to wait 10 years to get terrorists from one member state to another. It was the case of Rachid Hamda, one of the authors of the attack in Paris, Port Royal. It took 10 years for the British judge to send him in Paris and to be tried in Paris. So it was very impressive, not only the European arrest warrant, but it's also the definition of terrorism, and I'll come to that, and a push to bring the intelligence community closer to the European Union. All these achievements thanks to the leadership shown by Guy Verhofstadt at the time. So thank you for inviting me. I'll try to be brief and give you a bit a sense of where I think we are heading and what the heads of state and government might decide on the 12th of February. I think they will show a strong level of ambition. The motto is a lot, and I was the first to convey the same message at the meeting in Paris, chaired by Bernard Cazeneuve on a Sunday, the day of the Marche Républicaine, that there is indeed a need to do more quickly and more forcefully what has already been decided. We have a lot of instruments. We have, these last 2 years, worked a lot on the issue of the so-called foreign fighters or foreign terrorist fighters, but the devil is in the implementation. And I think by just doing in depth and forcefully what has been decided, we can achieve a lot. But there are several additional measures which are very much needed, and that will be translated into more integration. Mr. Verhofstadt just alluded to some. I don't know if in terms of intelligence, we'll achieve what he suggested, but we can make some progress. I mentioned yesterday in this same room, I think, a sentence of that the former chief of staff in the first administration of Obama had put on the wall of his office, never let a serious crisis go to a waste. I think we have to translate the strong political will which has been shown in Paris into concrete action. So, you know, there are different tracks preparing building blocks, to use the same words, to convey concrete measures to the heads of state and government. One is the Foreign Affairs Council, the second one is the Justice and Home Affairs Minister, and the third one was yesterday the ECOFIN ministers on terrorist financing. On the foreign policy side, I won't spend too much time on this, but I really welcome the leadership shown by Mrs. Mogherini. She really wants the EU to be more engaged in the direct vicinity of Europe. The countries around the Mediterranean are faced to the same threat, but we have underinvested with this country, especially after the start of the Arab Spring. I think we have not been up to the challenge. We have not helped them enough. And look at a country like Tunisia has, for the time being, more than 3,000 citizens fighting in Syria, and they say they have prevented 9,000 from going to Syria. And my friends in Algeria reminded me that the Black Decade, during which more than 100,000 Algerians were killed, started with the return of the Mujahideen from Afghanistan. So a strong democracy like Tunisia, with a less effective, and that's a good news because that was the arm of repression, effective security service, is not in the same position as they were before to digest the return of thousands of guys, more radicals, trained to use weapons and explosives, and maybe directed to kill. So do more externally, help them to beef up their response and develop smart policy, not only repressive policies, but also engage much more with the key players in the Sunni world, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Egypt. So I welcome this. I can later on develop if you want, but I would like to concentrate more on the internal aspect of the internal security. And I see 6 or 7 subjects where much more needs to be done. The first one, and rightly mentioned by Guy Verhofstadt, is of course the prevention, what the Americans call counterviolent extremism. I'm happy to see that, but the Commission has been pretty quiet for some time, a long period of time, that as from last year, early last year, the then Commissioner, I think member of ALDE as well, Cecilia Malmström, decided to invest a lot on prevention. For the first time, the Commission said something. They were a bit afraid to be too explicit because prevention people tend to equate prevention with Muslim, and the Commission doesn't want to ostracize part of the EU people. But I think it's important that we invest much more on this. I know the current Commission wants to do further steps. One is to transform the, what is called the Radicalization Aware Network, which is an excellent idea, connecting field workers and collecting the best practices at mainly local level into a center of excellence with money and experts that could be sent to the member states. For instance, my country, Belgium, really need experts to work in prison on radicalization. How do we handle the returns of hundreds of foreign fighters, for instance? On the 2 main incubators of radicalization, there is a huge need to do more. I mentioned prison, the other one is indeed internet. On internet, we have to develop smart policies in at least 4 respects. And to use the term used by my colleague in the Commission, we need to be a bit better to detect illegal content, to remove illegal content to create positive content, to challenge the narrative of Daesh and Al-Qaeda, and be able, and we had a discussion with Sophie yesterday, to read sometimes content. Let me just develop that in telegraphic terms. Detect content, we need to pull resources together. It's, for me, difficult to understand why we are not building a common capability at Europol, where people trained to read Arabic, Urdu, whatever, together monitor on a 24/7 the internet and produce analysis for the member states. We have a small platform called Check the Web, but it's mainly on the Web 1.0, should be on social media, should be staffed more, these people should be trained. That is something, I think, easily achievable. The second one is remove illegal content. I know it is sensitive. I've said yesterday, we have a different interpretation of the scope of freedom of speech in Europe. Between the Scandinavian and maybe the southern part of Europe, we have different interpretation as to the limit, if we want to set limit to freedom of speech. For instance, you cannot, and someone reminded the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz yesterday, in France or in Belgium, you are sent to a criminal court if you deny the Holocaust. This is something you can do in the US. In the US, and it's not a coincidence, if most of the neo-Nazi websites are hosted by American internet service provider, because the First Amendment, in a way, is much wider. So I know it's difficult, but still I think we need to remove from internet what is clearly illegal, or at least not consistent with the terms and conditions of the big companies. But to do that, you need to detect all this. A company, I don't know for Google, but for Twitter, they let 500 million tweets a day go through their service. So it's impossible for the company to detect all this. So we have to help them and refer to them and signal illegal content. And that's what we want to promote. Each member state should have a unit with people trained to do that. And I mentioned several times what Google told us, that when they received a referral from the UK unit inside Scotland Yard, in 93% of the time, they remove the content which has been signaled. When it's you and I, because we can flag an illegal content, it just happens in 33% of the time. Why? Because we may differ on what is illegal, what is distasteful, and so forth. So train and set up several units in the member states. But why don't we have a common unit as well? And I think we may make a progress here, and I think heads of state and government may agree to task Europol to do this for the 28th. That would be a good step. The third one, and I think you will touch upon this, we need to be as smart as Daesh in our communication. Again, don't have time to explain why I think people are going to Syria, but a lot could be achieved if we were smarter in our communication. That's why I invited the Commission, which accept this project, to develop a pool of expertise, and the Belgian state, the Belgian Minister of Interior, accept to host them to advise the member states to develop strategic communication, not only by government, but also by civil society. If we have more moderate voices, if we have people trained to set up a website, to challenge the single narrative of Daesh and Al-Qaeda, I think we will develop part of the solution. It will only be part of the solution, and I know it's meant to reach the average vulnerable people. You will never reach the IT geek, radical guy who go into the dark internet. That will never happen. And finally, read content. And we had this discussion in Libya yesterday, shortly, but in all our democracy, we have legislation which, under certain conditions, allow a security service, mostly after the warrant of a judge, or a law enforcement agency to intercept content. And the problem is that in some respect, you may find that as a good solution after the Snowden leaks, but that the main companies, Microsoft, Google, and others, develop very sophisticated encryption devices, very decentralized, so that at some stage it won't be possible for the police to intercept my mobile phone, even according to the law. And I would be a bit surprised that the democracy would disarm to such an extent that the police would be completely impossible to intercept criminal content, be it on organized crime kingpins or being terrorists. And I talked to one of the leading magistrates in Paris last week, and he said, I tried to follow the guy in contact with Daesh. They use WhatsApp and Skype. We cannot listen and intercept. Is it what we want? So there is, I can see the merit of protecting privacy through encryption, but shouldn't be the rule that under certain conditions, government should get access to the key for disencrypt some content. I asked the question, I think it deserves some discussion. So a set of measures on internet. The second one is on external border. Equally sensitive. When you mention that, you hear people saying, you want to question freedom, free movement of people. On the contrary, I think if we have in the future 3 or 4 or 5 other Nemush re-entering Europe undetected, you will hear more and more populist voices to challenge Schengen. You will get more and more pressure from the Americans to put conditions in the visa waiver program, because a bit everywhere people tend to think, which is completely untrue, that Schengen is the problem. That because we don't have internal border control, criminals can move everywhere. This is not true. My point is Schengen is not about free movement of people. It's about the flanking measures to compensate the security deficit that we think may flow from the lifting of internal border control. And we have started doing that in 1985, and we're still working on it. So Schengen is a constant process of refinement of the flanking measures. One refinement that I suggest is to foresee a systematic check on EU citizens at the external border when they cross the external border of Schengen. Why? Because otherwise, many people will cross the border undetected. The reaction is, of course, to say, oof, you will create huge queues in airport. I think when the decision was taken some years ago in the Schengen Code not to foresee systematic check, it's because we had not the technical tools to process these checks quickly. Now, with passport with biometrics, with passport readers, it takes half a second to check whether your name is known in the SIS. I know it's sensitive, but I think it's important. The other one is PNR. Again, maybe in the discussion, we'll raise that again. But my point is, and I'm deeply convinced of this, by refusing to have an EU legislation, we will, as a consequence, have a system which is less protective, less effective, and less European. And in fact, a false argument, we will not be in a position to inspire third countries. One likes it or not, all the countries in the world try to have a PNR system. And I'm not sure the way they will develop their PNR is consistent with our values and our definition of privacy. Why will it be less protective? Because we'll have 15 or 16 different ways to protect EU citizens. So me, as a traveler, I will be probably differently protected when I travel to France, I travel to Germany, to Denmark, and so forth. And experience, I've been 20 years in this business, experience is, and that's good news, when the EU adopted legislation, it's always more protective than national legislation. So less effective because we will have 15 instead of 28 system, less Europeans, because the more the Parliament refuses to enter into this discussion, the more member states will be tempted to work intergovernmentally. And there is no legal obligation, very few legal obligation for the member states to work in an EU framework. I've heard one Minister of Interior saying in the room, if we don't get what we want, we'll do that through an intergovernmental cooperation. And it will happen like this. And less a source of inspiration for third state, if we have our system, which is a fair balance between security and privacy, I think we may push other states to do the same. So that's my point. Finally, information sharing, that's what Verhofstadt said. Indeed, the main conclusions of the 9/11 Commission was that they had the dots, but they were not connecting the dots. And that's what led the Americans to develop a quite strong concept, the information sharing environment, which they push, like usually the Americans are always doing, so much that a foot soldier like Manning could get access to the secret cable of the State Department, and a guy working in a private company like Snowden could download 100,000 pages of secret document, because they move from a system of stovepipes between all the players to a system of a full information sharing environment. So we need to do a bit of the same. We should maybe go closer to this information sharing environment. And the second aspect is how do we handle the intelligence information to convince the intelligence community to work more with the EU tools and mechanisms. The legal problem we have is intelligence falls outside the EU competence. Article 4 of the Treaty on the European Union says explicitly member states are the prime responsible for internal security, and they are the solely responsible for national security. And national security, it is the world of intelligence. So we are trying to see how we can develop Europol as the hub for this information sharing environment. It will take time. It will need a lot of efforts to build that trust, but I think it's one way to achieve this. I don't have time to develop the need for a new legislation on data retention, but I think it's needed. For justice. Justice, we tend to forget how justice is important in the fight against terrorism. We tend to believe that it's only the Minister of Interior. I know I'm long, but I'll try to speed up. No. Justice is important because it's the best way to protect freedom. And this is something where some progress are needed. The first is to have a common definition of foreign fighting. A bit for the same argument as for the PNR. We need that because we need a level playing field. It's important for the law enforcement agencies in Europe as well as the EU law enforcement agency to have a common reference point. It is important to avoid prosecution gap, and it's important, I think, to have a source of inspiration for third states, because we know too well that third countries, not democratic countries, often use UN obligation to legislate in counterterrorism to curb the opposition and violate human rights. So if we have a strong, balanced definition, it could be something pretty effective. The second one I don't have time to develop, but we need to invest a lot on electronic evidence, IP address. We are working with 20th century mechanism with a 21st century electronic world. And finally, disengagement program. Something that I've said repeatedly, it would be a major mistake to bring most of the returnees from Iraq and Syria to jail. Prisons are a major incubators of radicalization. We have to the extent possible that people don't have blood on their hands, if we don't have strong evidence that they were part of the fight with Daesh and Jabhat al-Nusra, we have to put them in a rehabilitation process, but that requires expertise and money. 5, armed traffickings. I don't develop it, but there are several ideas, among which an amendment of Directive 91/477, especially on deactivated weapon. You can find AK-47 on internet, deactivated and reactivated easily because the standards are different in Europe. The internal-external dimension, also no time to develop it, but to project our tools and mechanisms like Europol, Eurojust, CEPOL externally, and especially in the northern part of Africa, is in a way to improve cooperation, but also to promote the rule of law. And finally, my last point, cohesion. I think I would hope that I hope the Commission will manage to find a way to mobilize the different instruments, the social fund, Erasmus, other means to design tools to support member states' policy in terms of cohesion, in terms of the fight against discrimination, anti-Semitism, and Pegida-type demonstration in some of our member states bashing the Muslim and Islam. And I think we could build on the immensely important movement started in Paris, Je suis Charlie, which we never had before, which is something quite interesting, and we need to find ways to make it last. I stop here. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for sharing that with us. Then we go immediately to Mrs. Eijkman from the, let's say, the perspective of the researcher.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me on such a short notice. I wanted to give a brief introduction of something that I usually discuss with my students at the Leiden University. I teach master's courses, Security and the Rule of Law and International Crisis and Security Management. What I wanted to share with you today, and Sophie asked me when she rang, is to give input for this action plan, which I actually just received, so it's right on time. But I want to highlight this issue of carefully balancing the decisions you make, carefully assessing the counterterrorism measures that are being proposed. As was mentioned by the earlier speakers, many of them are not very new, and I'd like to share some of the perspectives on it. I think what is very important when we discuss the issue of terrorism, and in particular foreign fighters, is to distinguish reality from perceived threats. And I'll give some examples. And I also reflect on current EU counterterrorism, and particularly in the context of this idea of anticipation, preventing and controlling the risk of that terrorism poses within the European Union. I also discuss in particular the side effects for fundamental rights, such as the issue of privacy, but also many other human rights are at risk. First of all, when I mention these things of the side effects for human rights, I'm not suggesting that terrorists or other people are respecting the human rights of us, but I want to sensitize the audience for the idea that some of the measures that are taken by governments to tackle terrorism also have counter effects, side effects for the protection of human rights. Now, the potential threat that foreign fighters pose. I'm sure that many of you are aware and maybe even have read different studies in terms of the threat of terrorism, the threat that foreign fighters pose to the European Union and to countries, individual member states. But I'd like to address, particularly in terms of the discussion, that there are certain mitigating factors. Many of the people who travel abroad to Syria, Iraq, etc. die. If you look at the numbers, for instance, in the Netherlands, we are not sure how many people have left. We think there are 163, but there are probably a lot more. 30 of them have already died, and 30 have returned. Many never return, but continue to fight. Now, of course, this is a threat, but I also want you to realize that these are very common issues. Also, many become disillusioned. Mr. de Kerkhover has just mentioned many of them return and become disengaged, and many also opt not to engage in violence. Others are arrested, as have demonstrated in the cases in Belgium last week and earlier, and have been disrupted. Now also, I think it's very important when designing this action plan that you have to be realistic. It's almost inevitable that a terrorist attack will happen in Europe or in the United States. Now, this is not a message the voters want to hear. This is not a message that people maybe here in the audience want to hear, but it is a reality. Now, there is also some good news. If you look at, for instance, at the Europol report for the number of terrorist attacks in the European Union, for instance, in 2013, there were 152 terrorist attacks, and unfortunately 7 people died. But if you look at the kind of terrorist attacks that were committed, only 2 were religiously motivated. So I think we also have to be quite open in terms of the exact threat of terrorism in the European Union, and certainly not think that it's just religiously motivated. These are just some statistics that you're probably aware of. Now, a second concept in terms of distinguishing reality from perceived threats. I'm sure many of you have read the report that was published 2 days ago by the Parliamentary Assembly by the Council of Europe on mass surveillance. It's just one of many reports that were published recently in terms of mass surveillance. But I also want us to be aware of the fact that we have to challenge and we have to ask ourselves to what extent do mass surveillance programs actually prevent terrorist attacks. They are very, very important puzzle in terms of collecting information, and maybe in the context of some terror plots, such as the Sauerland group in Germany a couple of years ago, the information that was collected by the National Security Agency probably did play a role in preventing or in detecting the plot. But we have to be very modest in terms of the relationship that between mass surveillance programs and actually the prevention of terrorism. Unfortunately, the reality is far more complex. And I really do suggest that everybody should read this report, but I'm sure you've sent it. Now, the second thing that is very important, and it was also just mentioned, is the monitoring of internet and social media. in the context of discussing foreign fighters, it has been mentioned a lot of the time that monitoring of social media and internet is very important. But exactly how does it relate? I think if you look at research in terms of foreign fighters, you learn actually that the role of social media is maybe not as powerful as sometimes suggested. And most of the people who are traveling are actually self-driven. And I was present, for instance, when the Dutch Security Services published this report on the transformation of jihadism in the Netherlands, which really discusses a lot of the trends in terms of foreign fighters in our country. And I noticed that many of the people present there, who are all counterterrorism fighters professionals, actually said that they were amazed about the role of human recruiters in this respect. In the Netherlands, most people who travel to Syria or Iraq come from 3 or 4 areas, cities such as Delft, The Hague, and some in the south of the Netherlands. And we should also therefore not underestimate the importance of these human recruiters, and also not overestimate the role that social media play. I'm not saying it should be monitored, but it's not maybe as effective as it might be suggested today. Now, there's a very, very big problem when we talk about, and this is the researcher in me, when we discuss terrorism research, and many of the reports you've read in terms of researchers lack empirical data. Terrorism studies is a very, very normative branch of studies. We all have an opinion, we're all against terrorism. But I think one of the problems is that this lack of empirical research also makes us, creates a situation where we make a lot of assumptions about why people travel abroad, why they want to fight in Syria, etc. So I also want to urge everybody here involved that supporting empirical research in terms of foreign fighters is a very, very important thing in terms of understanding their motive, and also not simplifying the reasons why people travel, etc. If you look at, for instance, we were very fortunate to cooperate with the Dutch National Police in terms of an empirical study of the Verhofstadt Group, the very well-known Dutch terrorist network. These were kind of the people that surrounded the man who killed the journalist Theo van Gogh. Now, actually, we came to a bit of a different conclusion than most of the literature and most of the reports about the Verhofstadt Group suggest. We actually came to the conclusion that, from our perspective, between 2002 and 2005, Mr. Theo van Gogh was murdered in 2004 in November, that there was no indication that there was a clear terrorist organization nor an ideological organizational structure of a home jihadist group. Oh, my computer went down. Now, the important thing to remember is not so much to remember whether the Verhofstadt Group is really a terrorist group or not. The point being is that in terrorism research, a lot of assumptions are made. And these assumptions are quite important to debunk, because it influences debates that are being held here, such as today in terms of the action plan. Now, if we move on in terms of, if we talk about the fundamental rights that are at stake, I think we can discuss on every single measure that is going to be proposed, that might be proposed, and Mr. de Kerkhoff has mentioned a lot of different ones. My point here being in terms of the side effects is that I do think for each and every measure, issues in terms of privacy of the masses, but also and data protection are quite important. But there's also something to be taken into consideration, that it's not a particular counterterrorism act that might have an impact in terms of protecting fundamental rights, but it's often different measures at the same time. For instance, what about a fair trial? When we discuss about that we have to develop if we have to collect evidence in terms of emails, in terms of social media, how do we make sure that public prosecutors present a fair case? What is the evidence? Are you just going to pick the messages where somebody is allegedly radicalizing, or are you also proposing a neutral, is there also some neutrality in terms of objectivity in presenting the kind of evidence in court? Second of all, in terms of, if we talk about prevention, a lot of the preventive measures that are being suggested, for instance, the entering into de-radicalization programs, to what extent do they sympathize or respect the freedom of speech or the freedom of expression? People are allowed to have a different opinion, and this is something that is sometimes quite difficult in the context of when we discuss counter-terrorism measures, especially in the context of national security. Now, I'm a big fan in terms of some of the proposals that have been made in this draft action plan that I've just received, in terms of cooperation and in terms of information sharing. But I also want to stress that from a fundamental rights perspective, be careful in terms of the accountability measures. Can people actually question the information that is being gathered about them? What are the checks and balances? Information sharing is a great thing, but what is information is being shared and how is this information constructed? This research that I led of the Verhofstadt Group, when we compared this with Australian cases and German cases, it was actually a research project about pre-incident indicators. We reviewed police files of terrorist plots that were thwarted. And we actually came to the conclusion that it's very, very difficult to establish neutral indicators of who is involved in terrorists and who is about to commit a terrorist attack. And this kind of information is very important, but it's not as neutral as it sometimes may assume. So who determines what the indicators are, and is there sufficient oversight? And when this information is shared between European states, but maybe also with third countries, what are the human rights criteria? Now, there is a mention in the draft action plan of your political group, there is a mention, there's the plurality of prevention strategies are mentioned. Now, prevention strategies are partly directed at de-radicalization, but some of them, and this is for me the most concerning bit, are also address the criminal justice arena. And one of the things that I'm worried about is that many of the people who are currently on trial or going to be on trial, for instance, in my countries, in terms of traveling to Syria, in terms of who are allegedly wanting to join the fight in Iraq. I'm very worried about the criminal offenses they are being charged with. Some of the terrorist offenses that they are being on trial for are quite stiff. Conspiracy to commit a terrorist attack, conspiracy to commit murder. And even though I understand that also from the criminal justice perspective we have to intervene, we also have to understand that many of them are quite young and that we are giving them a criminal record for life. And a terrorist criminal conviction is not something which is easy to get rid of. People do change. In the Verhofstadt Group, for instance, there were 30 to 40 people arrested. Not all of them were convicted, but I've had members of Verhofstadt Group in my class teaching them at university. People have changed, people do have the ability to change. And I also think that in terms of monitoring people and in terms of the effective prevention strategy, also from a criminal justice perspective, we also have to take into consideration when until when do you owe society, or until when is the debt that you have to society. People can change. Now, I know this is quite a difficult thing because in the context of the terrorist attacks in France, and Charlie Hebdo, probably two of them have had contact in the criminal justice system. But I also want to stress that you can't keep monitoring people on forever. People can change. Many people do change. And there is sufficient research, and I think Mr. de Kerkhoff has discussed this in terms of the disengagement. Now, last but not least, in the paper it's mentioned the national security and the subsidiarity principle. I think it's a great to address this subsidiarity, but one of the issues I want to raise, and this is quite an abstract point, but in terms of cooperation, in terms of information sharing, in terms of cooperation between different agencies and between different security agencies, between different member states. In theory, accountability structures often apply, but in practice, this is very often sometimes to monitor or to understand. And this is quite an important thing, because I think one of the things that the Snowden revelations have shown is that there might be accountability mechanisms and structures in theory, but in practice, is sometimes very challenging to apply. Now, whether this is because in my political context, members of parliament have no time or nor sufficient knowledge about national security or about cyberspace, I don't know. But I do feel that if more attention in this action plan is focused on information sharing and coordination, I think an efficient working accountability structure should supplement it. And last but not least, this accountability is also addresses in terms of judging when private companies or maybe, as Mr. de Kerkhoff suggests, in the future member states will judge whether the content of online messages are a threat to society or not. This is, of course, judged by national security agencies. I also would like that there are some objective standards, because I think there is a risk that legitimate political dissent will be suppressed in the name of national security. And this is not something that is just a threat in a country like perhaps Egypt, but it's a serious risk, I think, in the context of the European Union itself. Now, last but not least, I think in an earlier leaked document by Mr. Kerkhoff by State Watch this week, the official channel, yeah. I read something which I thought was very interesting and very hopeful. The dialogue with communities, among them Muslim communities in the European Union, in terms of issues, fundamental rights such as the freedom of speech. I really think this is a very important thing, but I also want to stress that we really have to be willing to listen to what they have to say. And we might hear things that are not pleasant to hear in terms of what people say about the cartoons, in terms of discrimination. But I do think if we are seriously willing to listen, like issues such as selective profiling, the feeling that people have that when they travel at airports and they're constantly stopped because, well, apparently for a neutral reason, but in practice it's not so neutral. I've experienced it myself when I was doing a PhD. My colleague had a Pakistani nationality. She was stopped at every airport in Europe where we traveled together. I was never stopped, and it was always a neutral stop, never based on her background and religion, but there was some coincidence that she was always the one who was stopped. I'm mentioning this point that the dialogue is very important, but if there are no measures that are perceived as discriminatory and if the measures are implemented selectively, you might in this dialogue hear things that we should also be willing to address. Now, if there are any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. Like I said before, my speciality is the side effects of counterterrorism measures. This is not to suggest that that I don't sympathize with the victims of terrorism as such, but I also think we have to be very realistic in what you can achieve in terms of counterterrorism measures. And many measures have already been taken in the European Union. So I also applaud this suggestion in the draft paper that most of the measures could be evaluated in terms of their effectiveness in fighting radicalization or violent extremism and terrorism. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And then we immediately move to our last speaker, Mrs. Harding, for Google.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we're just trying to make sure that this works. I don't think that working at Google actually means that you're very good at technology necessarily, so apologies for that. I think it's just about to come on. And thank you very much, firstly, for having us. We're really pleased to be here and take part in this conversation. It's just fallen out, so just forgive me while I just take some time to put it in. I have lots of pictures, so it's quite difficult to do it without it. Okay. So I just wanted to talk to you today about YouTube and how we tackle controversial content on YouTube. That encompasses a lot of different areas, but obviously today I'll mainly focus on extremist content. But just to start, I just wanted to give you a bit of context about YouTube because it just helps understand where we're coming from and how we've developed processes to deal with this. It's been something that we've been very thoughtful about for a very long time. I can't speak of all technology companies, obviously, but YouTube is actually 10 years old now, which makes us, you know, a sort of granddad in the technology world. And it means that we've had some time to really think about this and think about the right way to make sure that we can keep our platform safe. So this is, this is the first ever video uploaded to YouTube in 2005, and it's by one of the founders. And he is essentially saying, I'm at the zoo, and here's an elephant. Luckily, we've come on a bit further since then in terms of what's on YouTube. And YouTube now has 300 hours of content uploaded every single minute. And that content is weird and wonderful and varied and diverse. And as it says here, around 1 billion people, which is more than 40% of people on the internet, visit YouTube every month. It's also a truly global platform. So again, around 60% of a channel's views come from outside of the country where that channel was made. So it's a very diverse platform, but there's not just these funny little videos, amateur videos put on there, as much as we all like to watch pandas sneezing. It's also a platform for what we call creators, who are sort of young entrepreneurs, or not always young, from arts, entertainment, science, education, who are making truly amazing, wonderful, high-quality content that they're sharing on YouTube. And I just wanted to highlight just a few of them just from here in Europe. On the top left there, I don't know if any of you recognize him, but he is a Swedish gamer called PewDiePie. If you watch his channel and you don't play video games, it will be slightly strange, but he basically plays video games and comments over the top of them. And his channel has 33 million subscribers. Next to him, on the top right, is Zoella, who's a British YouTube star. She vlogs about beauty and fashion, and also about, you know, what it's like to be a young woman and dealing with pressures in society. She's worked with mental health charities in the UK to raise awareness around anxiety issues that she's had. And she has around 8 million views every month, 8 million subscribers to her channel that come and watch her videos every month. Her sort of German equivalent, Durham, is on the bottom left, who again has a million subscribers, and on the bottom right, Cyprian, a French blogger who, among other things, does comedy, who has 6 million fans. So these are just a few examples of the hugely successful creators that we have on YouTube, and they are businesses in their own right. Some of these guys make a lot of money doing what they do. So as you'll see, it's completely critical to us that this is a safe and vibrant platform for users, and also for the people who have their businesses on there. They don't want you know, really negative content on YouTube, and nor do we. So how do we deal with this? Well, in order to make sure that we have a safe platform, we have a set of community guidelines. As I say, this is important for users so that they're safe. It's important for businesses that operate on YouTube, and it's important for businesses that advertise on YouTube as well. We don't actively pre-screen for content, as Mr. Dukochev said earlier. We have 300 hours of content uploaded every minute, and to pre-screen those videos before they're uploaded would be like screening a phone call before it's made. It wouldn't allow YouTube to be this flourishing platform. So instead, what we do is we rely on our 1 billion strong community to help us flag and violations of our policies. And these are our community guidelines. Basically, they're online, and they decide what they set out what we allow on YouTube and what we don't. So some of that is fairly obvious. I've just highlighted a few here. You know, we don't allow nudity or sexual content. We don't allow graphic violence. We don't allow hate speech or harassment. And there's many others that you can look through that I won't take time going through. But today I just wanted to go through some of these and especially highlight some of the more difficult grey areas where we make exceptions. And we make exceptions mainly due to newsworthy, documentary or artistic or educational content. So an example of that would be we do not allow nudity on YouTube, but a breast cancer awareness video or documentary, we would make an exception for that. So I just wanted to talk through a couple of examples, and then I'll move on to extremist content specifically. So here's one example of an exception on the Nudity Prohibition, which is the Musée d'Orsay's channel. And this was a exhibition about masculinity and the male nude, which the museum produced especially for their exhibit. So we allowed this to stay up because it's an artistic video and it has artistic context. This is Betty. Betty works with an organization called Exit International, who advocate for euthanasia for people with terminal illnesses. Now, that might be a controversial issue, but Betty is allowed to discuss it on YouTube. But Betty went a step further in this video and provided instructions about how to create an exit bag. And so this video was removed because we don't allow harmful and dangerous content, and this was an instructional video. So it's a small nuance, but I thought it was an interesting example. And then violence. You know, again, as I've said, we do not allow graphic violence on YouTube. We don't allow violence that's gratuitous or intended to shock and disgust. But this is an example of the influx of conflict footage that we've seen on YouTube since 2009. Citizen journalists, regular people capturing atrocities happening in their communities and uploading it to YouTube to share it with the world. And you know, part of YouTube's ethos as a platform is to provide a place that people can, you know, document what's happening. And in some cases, it may be the only place that this is documented. In some really remote areas of Syria, you know, journalists aren't able to get to those areas, and the people there upload footage to show what's happening in order to share it with the world. And so here's an example of Neda Soltan, who sadly died in 2009 during the Iranian revolution and protests. And this is a very graphic video. So we thought very hard about this, and it was a very, a very difficult one to deal with because it's graphic. You know, she's bleeding from her head, and it's close up, and normally that wouldn't be allowed, but this was such a important video to Iran and to what was happening at the time that we decided to leave this and another conflict zone like it up on the site. Because like I say, sometimes there's media blackouts in the country. During the Ukrainian crisis, there was a media blackout, and Ukrainians sometimes were only able to see what was happening in their own country by watching footage put up on YouTube. So, you know, we're very, very thoughtful about these decisions, and as I say, we don't want very harmful content on there, but something like this we think is important to allow to stay. However, in all of those cases that I've just discussed, we would place a warning interstitial in front of the video so that you're not stumbling across it without knowing what you're about to see. And we will age gate the videos so that you have to be signed in as a user over 18 to see them. So when it comes to extremist content, again, as I've said, we're very clear that we do not want this on our site. It's not good for the community, and it's not good for the businesses on YouTube. And we have very clear policies in place that forbid hate speech, incitement to violence, graphic violence, as we've discussed. So we would and did remove, for example, the horrific ISIS beheading videos that we saw recently because of their graphic and insightful nature. However, as we've just discussed on nudity and violence and speech, there are issues where there are exceptions made because of the context of the video. For example, many media outlets did show portions of those videos. CNN, this is CNN's YouTube channel, they showed portions of the video, as did many other media sites. And therefore we allowed this to stay on the site because it has the appropriate news documentary context around it. So context is very key here. This did not have the graphic moment of beheading in it, but it was a clip of the video. And clips like this with the proper context, therefore, would have stayed on the site. However, this exact same video that you see here, with none of this news context around it, would not have been able to stay. And if there was any sign in the name that it was glorifying it, inciting violence further, then it would all be removed. So, you know, it does matter what context we see around it. Again, these warning interstitials would have been put in place to make sure that even though the graphic moment wasn't in the video, that you still, you know, it's still a disturbing video to watch. It can be, so to make sure that people didn't stumble across it. So I just wanted to briefly talk to you how that's about the decision making, but how the removals process works. As we've discussed, it's we are flagged, we are told about the video, and then we make a decision about what to do. This is a video that was taken during some Occupy protests, but you'll see with the green arrow that there's a flag under every single video, and if you see a video that you think violates our policies, anybody, you can click on the flag. And then when you click on the flag, you'll see more detail that helps you to report that video. We used to have just one Uber flag that you just click to say this violates one of your policies, doesn't matter what. But over time, we introduced this extra level of detail, including a very specific promotes terrorism flag. And people can add more detail in, you know, a timestamp of when the particular issue is, and so on. And then after a video is flagged, it's reviewed by our enforcement team. That's staffed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, constantly. And a human always reviews every single video because, as we've discussed, it's not a decision a computer can make. It might be an identical video with different context that in one case would be allowed to stay up and one case would not be. And that's reviewed and a decision is made. Maybe there's an age gate, maybe there's a warning interstitial, maybe it's removed, maybe it's allowed, maybe it's removed and the account is struck, and there's different decisions there. But as Mr. Kirchhoff said, there are community groups and others who do this on a larger scale, who do this all the time, and they're incredibly helpful to us. That program allows, it's called a Trusted Flagger program, and it allows groups to flag more than one video at a time. Just because, as you see from this, it takes some time to do it, and if there's lots of copies of the same video, you might want to flag more at once. And the reason that those groups, again, as you referred to, are more successful than your average user flagging is because they're very expert both in their own issue and in our community guidelines. Because some people think that hate speech is just speech that you hate, and they will therefore flag a Justin Bieber video. But they're less successful in having their videos removed. But people that are really taking it seriously, looking at it, and making sure that the community is safe, have a much higher success rate. And by success rate, all I mean is that they flag a video and we agree that it breaches our guidelines. It doesn't give any special right to take it down without us reviewing. It's always the same process, always reviewed by a human that's part of the YouTube team, and it doesn't give any further rights that you're more likely to have your video taken down. It's only more likely because they're more trained in our guidelines. One other thing I just wanted to touch on is this other, and again that Mr. Korchev said, was not only are we detecting removing content, but then it's about creating positive content. One thing that we've seen is that people are really outraged by what they are seeing, especially with ISIS, and are creating their own content to try and drown it out. So not just removing illegal content that violates our policies, but we're also seeing people make their own videos in response. And this has been incredibly popular and successful in a number of areas, not just extremism. So this is a quote from an analysis of online extremism by the counter-extremism think tank Quilliam in the UK, who showed how effective counter-extremism content can really be, because some of these viewpoints are unpopular, but if they're aired, there's a chance to tackle them and expose them. And we've really seen that a lot on YouTube. Here are some examples, not related always to extremism. On the far left the It Gets Better project. It was a young gay couple in America who created a video called It Gets Better to help young people that may be being bullied in school and suffering homophobic abuse, and to tackle the very high suicide rate in young LGBT people, they created this to try and say, look, it gets better, it's going to be okay, you know, don't take drastic action, talk to somebody. This video went viral, was hugely successful, and saw everybody from President Obama to, I think, you know, Beyonce, all sorts of people making their own It Gets Better videos. It was hugely successful, and you know, I don't have any analysis of this, but I'm sure could have been just as powerful as taking down, you know, negative content. In the middle there was some Turkish women who were posting smiling selfies after the Deputy Prime Minister of Turkey said that women shouldn't laugh in public. So they put many, many photos of themselves laughing up and videos of themselves laughing. It's not just on YouTube, it's on Twitter. In fact, the last example there is Twitter, which was after the hostage crisis in Australia. A woman, a Muslim woman, said she felt scared to ride public transport because she thought she would be attacked, and somebody replied saying, you know, don't worry, I'll ride with you to protect you. And it started this huge movement of hashtag I'll ride with you. Very, very moving and very, very powerful in really tackling these negative ideas. And we have seen it with extremism as well. This is one example, a Pakistani-American scholar of Islam who posted a response video to Innocence of Muslims, which was a very difficult case. And he said, you know, the proper course of action if people insult the Prophet is not to commit violence, but is to take it on. And he really talked people through how they could respond to that. So, you know, that was about saying, you know, don't be violent, you know, take people through it. And I think, you know, a lot of young people, when they're searching for information, they're curious, you know, they want to be able to find information that helps them counter these ideas. So this is a really great phenomenon that we're seeing. And finally, this is, you know, you mentioned the Radicalization Awareness Network, and they had a specific group that were working on counter-narratives. And something that came out of Commissioner Malmström's group was that Google Ideas was involved in too, was this cartoon, Abdullah X, from a young British Muslim who calls himself a forum extremist, and it's an animated series that's aimed to deter young people from turning to violence, and it's very theological, and it tackles issues of religion, but in a format that's more accessible for young people. So, you know, these are just examples, but I wanted to highlight them because, you know, sometimes it's, you know, we can talk about the negative videos, and hopefully I've covered off there how, you know, we take the worst stuff down from YouTube, absolutely, but how it can also be used as a platform for countervailing points of view. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we got a very wide range of issues on the table here. I will now very briefly, before I open the floor for questions and debate, I will very briefly take you through some of the highlights of the draft paper that you've all received in your mailboxes this morning. This is actually the harvest of the two debates that we had in Strasbourg. It's a summary of all the ideas that you have put forward. We had another debate last night with the Bureau of the group, where many of you were present as well, and we'll have a final debate next week, I believe, where we hope to adopt this paper, and it's our contribution to the debate on how to move forward with security, fighting terrorism, all in protecting the values that we stand for. So that's the background of the paper. So it's not final yet, but it is a reflection of the debates that we have already had. And I think some of the important points are, I think, first of all, the fact that we need to assess, that we need to evaluate what we already have, what instruments are already there, what measures have been taken. Guy reminded us that there are actually dozens and dozens of measures that have already been decided at European level, but now we need to assess to what degree they've been implemented by the member states and what they have yielded in terms of more security, what results did we get, and what unintended side effects they may have had. So we need to first of all evaluate the effectiveness and the implementation. This is actually also stated in a report adopted by Parliament in 2011, where we called on the Commission and the Council to do a very thorough evaluation, which of course then they subsequently ignored, as they do sometimes. But I hope that this time there will be a real push to look at what do we already have, what's in our toolbox. Do we need new tools? Do we need to revise the tools? Are there some tools which are ineffective? Let's have a close look at that. Secondly, I think one of our top priorities will be indeed how do we improve sharing of information and sharing of intelligence, because I think that it's becoming abundantly clear that there is a big, huge gap. There is a lot of information available. It was always available in many of the well-known attacks. He mentioned a few, Paris, Toulouse, 9/11, Paris, Madrid, London, Madrid, the killing of Theo van Gogh, Mumbai, Boston, you name it. In every single one of those cases, it was clear that information was left unused, and I think that's unforgivable. That should not happen again. Not every attack can be avoided, but if attacks take place while we have the information that we need, that is really unacceptable. So this is one of our priorities, how to improve the sharing. We will propose to transform the existing rather obscure outfit called INTCEN, Intelligence Center, which is operating in the context of the External Action Service, to transform that into a true European intelligence center or an intelligence agency called Eurintell, but not in the way it exists now and it operates now with very unclear legal framework. It should get a proper treaty base, a proper legal framework, and proper oversight mechanisms. And if we feel that if ultimately the goal should be mandatory sharing on the basis of shared standards, then there should also be more trust between the national security services. Because quite frankly, if you look at the tragic events of 2 weeks ago, to say, oh, well, you know, we just accept that they don't like sharing, secret services don't like sharing, I think that's not good enough. Then they should explain to the public why they find it more important to have their own little empires and sit on their island rather than really do what's necessary for more security. Eurintell will be one option. We'll also have to strengthen Europol, Eurojust, CEPOL, the training facility for police officers, and also elaborate on EPO, the prosecutor's office, and that should eventually, in the long term, become a fully-fledged European prosecutor. Then, of course, all of this, I mean, we wouldn't be liberal Democrats if, for us, this would all take place without all the necessary safeguards, the legal safeguards for citizens and mechanisms for proper democratic oversight. We need definitions, common definitions. One of the definitions, and that I've actually asked the European Commission about, is the definition of national security, because we all think that's very straightforward, but it isn't actually. There's a lot of European legislation that refers to national security as a ground for exemption to civil liberties, for example, or other legal safeguards. But what national security is that legislation referring to? We don't know. Is it the Dutch national security? Is it the Austrian national security? Is it the national security of the United States, of Russia? We don't know. That is unclear. So we need proper definitions and we need a proper legal framework. Then, and we also need to distinguish very clearly between law enforcement on the one hand and intelligence and national security on the other hand. They're two different kinds of activities, and we need to distinguish, and therefore I'm always a bit worried when I hear that Europol should become the place for sharing intelligence information. No, it is a police outfit, it's not an intelligence agency, and we should distinguish very clearly between the two. Then there are a couple of other things which have also been mentioned both by Mr. de Kerkhoven and Mrs. Eijkman, is investing more in human intelligence, you know, not just fighting terrorism from behind our laptops and thinking that we can monitor everything on the internet, but you actually need to be there on the ground and know what people are talking about, what they are thinking, what is going on in certain groups. We need to invest in external policies, which are an important dimension. Prevention, that is maybe last on the list, but certainly not the least. It's actually the start of everything, and I think we actually have some people in our group who have a lot of experience themselves with prevention programs, and it's also relevant to do this at the European level, because if some countries are very strong on prevention programs, but other countries don't do anything about prevention, then we all have a problem as Europeans, because we have open borders. So this is also something that we need to do together, and there needs to be a bit more pressure there to also expect certain standards from the member states. And then finally, I was just thinking, as we were having this debate, and I mentioned Liberal Democrats care a lot about legal safeguards. Of course, we're also emphasizing a lot the need for proper data protection legislation, for example, and the stronger the powers are that we give to the security forces, the stronger the safeguards need to be. If I hear talks about an encryption ban and blanket monitoring on the internet, I think that we really need to talk about what if there are any safeguards left, actually. That's something. It's already been stated that we will not give up on free movement and open borders, but within that space we need to make sure that we keep our people safe. But finally, and I was just thinking, this came up as I was listening to the presentation, Mr. de Kerkhoven is the counterterrorism coordinator of the European Union. And that will be a position that will probably be increasingly important and influential, but in the same vein as having proper safeguards and oversight mechanisms, maybe we should then also have a rule of law and fundamental rights czar to be the counterweight of that, so that we always have the two dimensions and that we have the balance. And then my final remark, I think that we also need a lot more technical knowledge. We don't only need people who know about security or about law and fundamental rights. We also need a lot of people, also in the judiciary, for example, who know their technology. I think that's very important to understand the implications of all the measures that we may take or may not take, and what is possible, what is not possible. Okay, and I think that the debate we have here this morning is very useful, because as an ALDE group, we like to get lots of facts and figures on the table. We like evidence-based policy making rather than assumption-based policy making. Okay, having said all that, I'm going to open the floor for debate. I have 3 requests for the floor already. Okay, I'm going to take your names, but I first give the floor to Renate Weber.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I'd like to thank all our guests who shared today with us their own views and opinions on how to combat terrorism while also preserving our fundamental rights. Of course, it is our duty to protect our citizens, people in general, and ourselves, by the way. And to do so, we have to protect their safety, our safety, but of course also our liberties and our rights. And I will start with the truism. Our rights are not absolute rights, of course. If I look into the European Convention of Human Rights, with the exception of not to be held in slavery and not to be tortured, not even the right to life was not an absolute right for many, many decades, because the death sentence existed. Thank God we got rid of it. But in other states within the European Council of Europe membership, there is still possible to have it. The problem is not that we do not understand that rights must be restricted when there are also other values, such as our life safety while combating terrorism. And the restriction per se, I wouldn't say is the problem. The problem is how we do this restriction, how we make this restriction, and what are, in fact, the legal guarantees. Mostly, I mean, in the last weeks, we discussed about freedom of speech, freedom of media, and of expression, and of course, we discussed a lot about our privacy and our data protection. It's not the collection of the data per se which is so problematic as it is why is this data collected, with whom it is shared, who will benefit from it. Because the truth is that when we look into the whole issue with Snowden, I mean, we understand that these data have been misused for years, also for commercial purposes, for anything else but for what they were collected initially. And here we have a problem. And in this respect, I would like very much to know, for example, what Mr. Kirchhoff think about the ICJ decision on data retention. You mentioned you don't want to go very much on this, that we need a new directive, but I'd like to hear your opinion on this. Also, considering that the fact that the decision of the ICJ was taken does not affect that much the behavior of the member states. Here is it's something which, I don't know, put us in a position where to think of, okay, but then what is this European Union about and what is this legislation about? In my own country, for example, in Romania, during the last couple of months, we had 3 decisions of the Constitutional Court considering data retention unconstitutional, the cyberspace legislation unconstitutional, and also the obligation to give your data when you buy a prepaid card, also unconstitutional. Is it too much? Can we still protect ourselves on this? On the paper, I would like only to make 2 comments. To change treaties to consider national security something which can be dealt with at the European level, I would very much welcome this, but my own experience negotiating for 3 years the new Schengen governance showed me that the member states are not ready to accept such a treaty change. On the EPPO, I have to say that I strongly oppose the idea that the current mandate of the EPPO should be enlarged as to cover also counterterrorism, because the way it is conceived these days within the European Union, only to tackle the financial interest of the Union as provided for by the treaty, it's a mess. So I would not enlarge this. But I am a strong supporter of Europol, increasing the capacity of Europol and of Eurojust. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Before I give the floor to Annelie, the next speaker on the list, first of all, even if we have sufficient time, I would ask colleagues to be sort of concise, because that makes the debate a bit more animated. And then I also propose that after every round of 5 speakers, I'll come back to the panel so that they don't have to listen to all the interventions for an hour and a half, and then they can only summarize. We really would like to get some answers. So I'm going to take batches of 5, and then come back to the panelists in the same order. Annelie.
Okay, thanks. First, some questions. And I would like to ask, could we manage with these tools we have today if we really use them? And if not, what's the most important measure to do? And then concerning information and sharing intelligence information, is it more question of attitudes than tools, so that every state wants to keep its own information, and even if we change our legislation and collect more information, it's no use? And then at the beginning of Georg's speech, he said that EU has moved so quickly that you have never seen so rapid action. And I think it's good, but at the same time I hope that we don't make unnecessary decisions. And at the same time, I would like to say that concerning tax havens, Juncker and European Union is not interested at all. No measures has proposed, even if it's some months ago, and I would like to say that Juncker, European Union, maybe European Parliament is too near those people who get benefits from tax havens, and we are not so close to those people who are terrorists. That's why we can make proposals. Thanks.
Okay, third one on my list, Angelika.
Thank you very much. I would first of all like to thank all panelists. It was very, very interesting and a very broad range of topics being touched. I would just briefly ask Mr. van Kerkhove, more or less into the same direction as Renate Weber already lined out. You are aware of our group being very skeptical about the data retention issue as such. And as it was already discussed yesterday in the LIBE committee and noted by Mr. Giovanni Buttarelli, the European Data Protection Supervisor, that we need to look for a toolkit to better assess proportionality in this respect. I would just like concretely to ask you if you would like to share your views on what such a toolkit could look like and into which direction your thoughts go. Thank you.
Thank you, Beatrice.
Yes, thank you, Sophie. Thank you, everybody, all of you, for being here. We have been talking about intelligence, and I think the first proof of intelligence has been the selection of the speakers today, because the approach, the different approach, and the combination of them all has been really explanatory and clarifying. I would kindly ask you to use your translation now, because I would like to speak in Spanish to give you some comments and idea on this very briefly. Me gustaría simplemente, porque creo que el resumen que ha hecho Sofía al final de lo que hemos aprendido y por dónde van las claves de este tema, creo que está muy bien. Es decir, es clave el juicio crítico, la evaluación, la mejora en el intercambio y sobre todo tener claro cuáles son las salvaguardias imprescindibles. Pero volviendo al tema de la inteligencia, yo creo que la clave ante la que nos encontramos ahora es ser capaces de entender que si en el mundo global en el que estamos se habla y se asume que la esencia es la inteligencia colectiva, tenemos que asumir que esa inteligencia colectiva implica decisiones. La inteligencia colectiva implica no solamente utilizar todos los recursos disponibles, los humanos, los tecnológicos, pero sobre todo también los colaborativos, y también tener en cuenta cuáles son las reglas del juego en este mundo colaborativo y global. Y creo que uno de los aspectos fundamentales, y se ha repetido desde los distintos puntos de vista, tanto desde la Oficina de Contraterrorismo, muy práctica, muy dirigida a acciones clave, como desde la visión de ojo con los efectos colaterales, pero también desde el mundo de Internet, es que es importante invertir en los orígenes, hay que identificar los motivos y las razones, pero sobre todo para luchar contra el mensaje, contra el discurso del odio, que es el que está al final detrás de todo ello, lo que hay que hacer es generar y producir el mejor y el mayor contenido posible positivo. Y ese contenido positivo no es solamente hacer vídeos que digan cómo hay que posicionarse, que también es cierto. El contenido positivo implica que los Estados tienen que tener clarísimo que o toman una determinación clara de que el futuro es común y la decisión de hacer en común la política exterior de defensa y de seguridad tiene que ser común, o no tendremos opción. Y el terrorismo es un problema europeo clarísimo. Somos muchos los países que tenemos experiencia en cómo afrontarlo. Los cuerpos y fuerzas de seguridad nacionales son extraordinarios en muchos casos. En mi país, en España, puedo asegurar que son un ejemplo y una referencia y que la voluntad de colaboración es plena. En resumen, solamente quería decir que para estas medidas que estamos planteando ahora mismo desde el Grupo Liberal, y yo creo que es importantísimo que lo dejemos claro, vamos a defender, por supuesto, las libertades, vamos a ser muy vigilantes respecto a esto, pero por encima de todo lo que vamos a defender es un proyecto común, que es en el que está en juego nuestra seguridad. Gracias.
Thank you. Last speaker in this round, Gérard.
Oui, Présidente. D'abord, une remarque en forme de boutade, si je peux. Je proposerais que, sur base de l'exposé qu'elle a fait, on prenne une première décision qui est de soumettre notre projet au regard critique de Mme Eichmann, pour voir si, in fine, c'est une boutade, si, in fine, l'ensemble des conséquences négatives qu'elle décrivait pour chacune des mesures que l'on peut prendre ne dépasserait pas le bilan positif. Donc, faisons usage de l'intelligence de l'école néerlandaise critique. Bien. Cela dit, j'ai 2 ou 3 questions à poser, je les adresserai à M. Gilles de Kerchove. Première, j'ai cru comprendre, M. de Kerchove, que vous plaidez pour qu'au niveau des frontières extérieures, on procède à un chèque systématique, y compris pour tous les ressortissants de l'Union européenne. Pour que cela ait un sens, il faut bien évidemment qu'on puisse coupler ça à d'autres informations. Donc il faut qu'il y ait dans le SIS des informations que les États membres soient obligés de transmettre, sinon vous allez ajouter une formalité qui n'a pas d'intérêt opérationnel. Et pour que ces informations obligatoirement transmises par les États membres aient un sens, il faut aussi qu'elles obéissent à des définitions harmonisées. Donc, si je comprends bien, lorsque vous dites cela, ça implique 2 éléments préalables, qui est à la fois une définition harmonisée du terrorisme ou des combattants étrangers, par exemple, et puis la transmission obligatoire des informations par les États membres. Si vous ajoutez à ça le PNR, d'un autre côté, est-ce que vous n'êtes pas occupé à introduire globalement un système que j'appellerais, est-ce que c'est vers ça que vous pensez qu'il faut s'orienter, d'entrée et sortie dans l'espace Schengen? Parce que si vous avez le PNR pour l'aviation, si vous faites ceci à tous les points d'entrée dans l'espace européen, globalement, vous allez savoir tout qui entre et tout qui sort de l'espace européen. Ou bien je me trompe? Est-ce que dans votre esprit et dans les mesures que vous proposez, ça est implicite? Deuxième question. J'ai cru comprendre qu'il y a dans votre approche à l'égard d'Europol plus que des nuances par rapport à la proposition qui figure dans la note du groupe ALDE sur l'Eurintell. Il m'a semblé que vous étiez beaucoup plus pour densifier et diversifier les missions d'Europol que pour la création de ce nouvel instrument. Donc, avant de marquer mon accord sur Eurintell, j'aimerais avoir votre sentiment sur le type d'instrument qui est le plus adéquat pour répondre aux missions dont vous pensez qu'elles sont les plus urgentes du point de vue de notre sécurité. Merci.
Thank you. Mr. de Kerchove.
Thank you. I'll take all the questions one by one. My opinion on the ruling of the Court of Justice on data retention. I've said that yesterday. I happen to have been involved in the negotiation of the data retention directive, which was quite an experience, I must say, because it was a bit like the European arrest warrant, 6 months of intense discussion between the Council, at the time the UK presidency, Charles Clark, it was just after 7/7, the London bombings, and the European Parliament, which at the time had cold feet and was not completely convinced, but at the end of the day, the data retention was adopted, directive. It's indeed a strong message sent by the Court of Justice. Nobody denies this. The main message is that we cannot collect bulk data about innocent people if it's not really, if we don't prove necessity, and it's a bit often disproportionate. But my reading of the decision is a lot of what the court said, who am I to interpret the court, is due to the weaknesses of this directive, but it was a consequence of the lack of legal basis at the time. If we had been in a post-Lisbon legal environment, we would have adopted a completely different legislation with the same objective. We would have foreseen much more demanding rules on who can get access, for how long can we keep the data, for which sort of objective, and so forth. All the detail that we could not at the time define because the legal basis was the first pillar internal market legal basis, and the rest, the modalities, condition for access, control and so on, was left for the member states. And it's true, because of this weakness, when you read the Data Retention Directive, you may have the feeling that it is a big broader enterprise. So I don't know if the court will keep on developing the same policy vis-à-vis other instruments if we are able to build in the system sufficient safeguards. I'm a fan of the concept of privacy by design, which has been developed by the Data Protection Supervisor of Ontario. And instead of to have always this confrontational discussion between the data protection geek and the security geek, where we don't talk to each other, is to sit together and try to find, I don't like the metaphor of the balance because I think it's untrue. In a way, legally speaking, the right for privacy is a fundamental right, and it's only exceptionally that you can violate this right. I don't challenge that. I happen to be the one who, funny enough, drafted the two provisions of the Charter of Fundamental Rights on this, because I was Deputy Secretary of the Convention which drafted the Charter. So I believe in it. But I think technology, and if we sit in a constructive way, we can achieve both. Find a way to be more effective if we think it's necessary, and at the same way, design sufficient safeguards and even sanctions. I've always said, I don't understand why you don't foresee criminal sanctions for those who abuse and violate human privacy. We have soft administrative sanctions. If you believe it is of so importance, let's send people to a jail. Believe me, they will reflect twice before mishandling data. So that's a bit my answer. The question is, will you refuse by definition any sort of collection of massive data about innocent people? Because it is true. We have seen an evolution over the years. Until 5 years ago, we were mainly collecting data about crooks, suspected people, criminals, that's criminal record, police database, that's classical. And then we made a shift towards collecting data held by the private sector, here telecom operators and service providers, and about everyone. If you stop the discussion and say never, then we're in trouble. Or we say it may be useful for certain forms of crime, and I accept that the risk is the slippery slope. You start doing that for terrorism, and then you extend it for organized crime, and then it's so tempting that you would move to tax evasion or other forms of small, it's not a minor crime, but less worrying than terrorism or serious organized crime. We should not forget serious organized crime. So that is the core of the discussion. But I think if we accept to collect that sort of data, let's build in the system all the necessary safeguards. And I think we can achieve a fair balance. So that's my opinion on the ruling. may look a bit too excessive, but I'm convinced we can do both. What are the important measures to fight in recent development? I've tried to single out the most. There is not one single measure that we have not thought of and not decided yet and would have prevented Paris or would have changed the course of history. I think we can achieve already a lot by implementing what we have decided. In October, I made, I don't know how many, 22 proposals for addressing the foreign fighters phenomenon in May 2013. And if you look at Resolution 2178 of the UN Security Council, it's 95% what I suggested, and it was 1 year, more than 1 year later. But half of them have not been implemented yet. Indeed, moving, and I think it's in your proposal of action plan, systematic electronic check of travel documents at the external border. In a way, I will answer to Gérard Deprez as well. We're not there yet. I think in Zaventem, when I come back from the US, there is a visual check of my passport. The guy is trained to see if it looks a bit fake, but he does not know if the Minister of Interior has withdrawn my passport, because that cannot be seen. He sees if it's not a counterfeit. So we should quickly arrive to an electronic systematic check of all the passport with a link to Interpol database on lost and installed passport, and that would already be a major achievement. And that does not require to change the Schengen border code, but it requires that you deploy machine readers at the green borders, at the sea borders, at the airport, and not all member states have done that so far. So internet, I said, referral units, the Brits have one, but what about the other member states? That does not require any legislation. So from what I said, there's a lot we can do in the current legal framework. Information sharing, is the problem a question of attitude or a problem of creating new mechanisms? It's a very good question. I believe, and I will answer in a way to the question of Gérard Deprez as well on intelligence and Europol. My problem is that Article 4 of the Treaty on the European Union set a legal limit to what the EU can do. I think, legally speaking, our legal service will just read and say, it's nice, but we don't have a legal base to adopt a legislation to transform INSEN into Eurintell. It's not legally possible. We may like it or not. It's what the negotiators of the treaty have decided. Second, and that's an answer to I think, what Sophie said on not blurring the division between intelligence and police information. The problem is that there is no definition of what is an intel information. I've never seen a definition. What I know, it's more an organic definition than a substantive definition. An intel is an information held by an intelligence agency or security service. It's not satisfactory, but it's how it is for the time being. So, in countries where the security service is the main actor on foreign fighters, for instance, most of the information on foreign fighters are called intelligence and not law enforcement information. And that's what leads me to believe that we could, for instance, design mechanisms at Europol to meet the requirement of this community, because this community has a lot of rules. They want to protect source and methods, and we can understand. If someone is infiltrated in a terrorist organization and feed the security service, first, we don't want this person to be in trouble. We want to keep our source, so we have to protect. You may say that the police has the same requirements, but it's very, very strong. The second rule, which is a sort of golden rule, what is called a third-party rule. If France gives an information to Belgium, Belgium cannot share this information with the Netherlands unless it has been authorized by the originator, by France, because otherwise it will be circular. Because if Belgium shares that with the Netherlands and then the Netherlands with France, the French will say, by Jove, my information was so good that even the Dutch confirm my information. But it's the same who are just circulating among them. So that is a sort of makes it difficult to have a completely multilateral exchange at all times. So we have to define software to take that into account. But it is possible, I think. Additionally, trust is of the essence here. And it's, in a way, the answer to your question. you can decide to set up an intel by law. If people don't trust each other, they will never share a sensitive information with a country where someone shared the information with the Russian. Let's be honest. Or with other countries which are not... bon. So this trust takes time to build. It can disappear overnight. So it's more, what can we do to slowly build that trust? I remember when Prime Minister Verhofstadt was chairing the European Council on the day after 9/11, he tried to push the intelligence community to come closer to the European Union. They tried to resist as much as they could, and their response was to create what they call the CTG, the Counterterrorism Group, and it's a dedicated subsidiary of the Bern Club. And I often say it's funny to see that the club of the intelligence people is called the Bern Club. And they dedicated a subgroup to work on counterterrorism on a 24/7. They share a lot. I will never send the signal because I'm convinced, and that's what I say, and I cannot measure it because I'm not operational myself. A lot is shared among those, as I say, who need to know. So outside the EU framework, intelligence is intensively shared. So maybe what we could ask for as a first step is to have, to institutionalize or professionalize more the cooperation outside the EU framework, but we cannot say anything, we don't have the competence. Pour rebondir sur la question de Gérard Depré, je pense que dans un premier temps, mais je pense que c'est pas quelque chose qui s'obtiendra facilement, c'est de créer les conditions à Europol pour que tous les acteurs de la sécurité, en ce compris les agences de renseignement, trouvent utile de partager l'information qu'ils ont, on peut l'appeler police ou renseignement, et donc il faut trouver les mécanismes, une sorte de mécanisme qui protège une information décentralisée, qui permet de protéger l'anonymat de l'information, mais de permettre des croisements. Et je fais référence notamment à ce que les cellules de renseignement financier, FIUs, ont développé depuis quelques années. Ils ont développé un mécanisme qui s'appelle Match 3, d'un logiciel qui permet de transformer un nom en une série de chiffres. Gérard Depré devient 4827. Et donc
c'est lui donc.
Oui, c'est lui.
Ah, j'ai déjà vu ce chiffre.
Voilà. Eh bien, justement, ça permet de faire un match. Parce que M. Verhofstadt a aussi le 4827. Mais vous ne savez pas que c'est M. Depré qui est en cause. Et donc, il y a moyen de trouver des formules, mais il faut y travailler. Et alors, dernier élément, ne mésestimons pas le potentiel. Alors, il faut distinguer le renseignement opérationnel du renseignement stratégique. Je pense que l'Europe doit investir massivement dans le renseignement stratégique. INSEN, ce n'est que du renseignement stratégique. INSEN n'est pas opérationnel. Donc, on ne va pas nous dire s'il y a une cellule à Molenbeek ou... En revanche, je trouve que depuis 10 ans, INSEN a fait des progrès fantastiques. C'est de plus en plus intéressant en termes de renseignement stratégique. Quand Mme Ashton ou Mme Mogherini va négocier le programme nucléaire, il est indispensable qu'elle ait le meilleur renseignement au monde sur l'état de développement du programme nucléaire iranien. Sinon, ça n'a pas de sens. Et si moi je rencontre un homologue saoudien, c'est utile que je sache qu'est-ce qu'on pense sur la possibilité qu'il y ait des financements qui quittent le Golfe et qui financent Daesh. Ça, c'est quelque chose auquel on peut progressivement, qu'on est en train de développer. Et je dirais, si vous réfléchissez, mais il faudrait avoir la volonté, le leadership et les moyens, la Commission européenne est une source de collecte d'informations absolument fantastique. On visite les aéroports dans toute l'Europe, on contrôle les entreprises, on fait de la veille sanitaire. Et donc, on pourrait très bien, avec un peu d'organisation, faire en sorte que l'Union européenne soit une source de renseignement stratégique fantastique, fantastique. On a des délégations. Bientôt, on aura le plus grand réseau diplomatique du monde. Les États n'arrivent plus à suivre. Et donc, en enrichissant les profils de ceux qui travaillent dans nos délégations, avec tous nos rapports avec les pays tiers, avec le travail de la Commission, il y aurait, à mon avis, là, un potentiel énorme. Et deux autres, et puis je termine. Sur l'autre question de Gérard Depré sur les frontières extérieures, je ne peux qu'être d'accord avec ce que Gérard Depré a dit. Un contrôle systématique aux frontières qui s'appuie sur un SIS qui est mal alimenté par les États membres n'a aucun sens. Et d'ailleurs, ça fait 1 an et demi qu'on a cherché à convaincre, notamment les services de renseignement, d'alimenter le SIS avec du renseignement. Il y a l'article 33 ou 36.3 de la législation relative au SIS de la deuxième génération qui permet aux services de renseignement de signaler une personne aux fins d'observation ou aux fins d'arrestation. Le signalement aux fins d'observation, c'est un renseignement, c'est du pur renseignement. Et donc, ce n'est pas simple de les convaincre de le faire, parce que beaucoup craignaient qu'en mettant ça dans le système, la personne qui fait le contrôle aux frontières n'étant pas nécessairement bien formée, tout d'un coup voit un drapeau rouge allumé en disant « retour d'un combattant de Syrie », et donc dans son comportement body language, se met à transpirer, de sorte que la personne sache qu'elle est connue. Et par définition, il faut que tout ça soit extrêmement... Donc, on est en train de travailler à l'alimentation du SIS. Votre document dit une alimentation obligatoire. J'ai des doutes, c'est à mon avis plutôt rhétorique, mais il faut construire des mécanismes qui font qu'ils ont envie d'utiliser. Et je vais vous dire que l'alimentation du SIS a progressé de manière énorme sous l'initiative de la France ces derniers mois, et donc on peut faire encore plus, etc. Est-ce que couplé avec le PNR, c'est un système d'entrée-sortie? Je ne pense pas qu'il faille... le but, c'est simplement de vérifier si une personne est connue dans les fichiers de police, mais pas de savoir si elle rentre, elle sort. Je dois dire qu'à titre personnel, j'ai aucune envie qu'on sache que je rentre et je... Mais ça, c'est une question de logiciel et de protection. Ça, mes sorties de l'Union européenne ne regardent que moi. En revanche, que l'on sache, si je suis un serial killer, que l'on puisse le contrôler quand je sors et je rentre, honnêtement, s'il n'y avait pas Schengen, est-ce que vous pensez 5 minutes qu'aucun État membre déciderait de ne pas contrôler les gens qui rentrent chez eux? Si demain on oublie Schengen, croyez-moi, et la Belgique, et la France, et l'Allemagne vérifieront tous ceux qui rentrent. Et ça ne serait pas un débat. Parce que c'est normal qu'on contrôle les serial killers quand ils rentrent dans un espace, non? Sinon, les bases de données n'ont pas beaucoup de sens. Yeah, sorry.
No, I didn't want to cut you off.
No, just on counter message, it's something we need to do much more. And Abdul X, that the colleague mentioned, we need to do Abdul X times 100,000. So it's like the ice bucket challenge. We need to be viral, to have huge counter message on the internet. And Je suis Charlie is the potential for a huge counter narrative.
Thank you. Mrs. Ekman.
Thank you. I have little to add to what was just mentioned in reference, but to the question, can we manage with these tools? I think we can, but we have to be honest. And I think the honest message is that counterterrorism is the business of reducing risk, but there's not 100% security. And I think we also have to credit our security and intelligence services and law enforcement agencies with what is already happening, because we can also reverse the question, why have not more attacks happened the last 6 months or the last year? A lot is being done. And I think sometimes we only look at what went wrong. In terms of the and in addition to that, can we manage with these tools? Yes, if we have enough human resources. I've been working for about 5-6 years now in terrorism research, and I've noticed 2-3 years ago there was a lot less money for radicalization work, de-radicalization work, and I've literally seen a lot of prevent officers in the United Kingdom, for instance, losing their jobs because there was no longer any money available to keep them on, and now I'm sure that will be invented. Last but not least, intelligence, both on an operational level as on a strategic level, it only works if you have something to give. A prevent officer who is just working in a local community in Bristol, somewhere in the UK, and is just talking about, is your son going to travel? What about this and that? And people say, we have different problems. We have problems with people who are not having jobs. We have problems because we can't get a permit for our mosque, etc. So I think intelligence on the lowest level, whether it's through a community police officer or through a prevent officer, decriminalization officer, you also have to give something to people, to the community, where you want information from. In terms of changing security culture, it's very, very challenging. Law enforcement, both in law enforcement culture as in national security agencies, the culture is very much to keep information, but this can change. But I think the important thing, and it was just mentioned, is that there's political will at the moment to change that, but it's going to be very, very challenging to implement. Last but not least, I also want to reference that was made in terms of the border controls. It's not necessarily my expertise, but I do think in terms of the action plan to refer to this issue of function creep is a big, very, very important. We've had it in the Netherlands with automatic number plate recognition, which was introduced through legislation in our country to, amongst other things, to deal with terrorism. But in fact, it's mostly used to deal with people who have taxes still to pay to the police. So I think we have to be quite careful in terms of this function creep. Last but not least, somebody mentioned in terms of intelligence that we increasingly live in a globalized world and we live in a world of cyberspace. Of course, this is true. Intelligence is worth nothing if we don't share, if we don't cooperate. But I do want to challenge our line of thinking in how we legalize this. I think it was already mentioned before that the law is always behind, but how do we legalize computer searches? How do we legalize this de-encryption? I'm personally not a fan of it, but that's my personal opinion. But even if you do it, then what are the laws and what are the checks and balances? And can you actually have an access to an effective remedy? And this access to an effective remedy is a big problem, not just in PNR, but also in a lot of other executive measures that are being proposed in the name of counterterrorism. Thank you.
Okay, Mrs. Harding.
I think the only real area I just wanted to comment on was counter speech being well produced and the best possible content. I think that's completely right. We don't want to lose this counter speech battle because of low production values of the videos, but a lot of the community groups, Muslim community groups and NGOs working on counter-extremism don't have the same expertise to make their videos as popular. So something that we've done at Google is had a series of counter-speech seminars where community groups can come in and our creators, some of those successful creators that I showed you, as well as people that work at YouTube, have given them training in lighting and camera work, as well as the most successful creative strategies for ensuring that your video is popular and those types of things. And we've done that in the US, in the UK, and in France, and we'll continue to do that to make sure that the expertise that people that work in the company or people that in technology generally have is shared with those groups, trying to get those messages across.
Okay, thank you very much. We now proceed to the second round of questions, but I have 7 more people on my list, including myself. If anybody else wants to intervene, can they signal that now? Okay, 1 more. Nobody else? You're on the list already? Okay, then we close the list. I suggest that the second batch is then 8 questions. And in order to be able to really end at 12:30, I really ask everybody to be as concise and clear as possible, both the colleagues in the room and the panelists, and then we'll all be able to wrap it up at 12:30. Enrique.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, now it's all right? Yes. Thank you very much. I'm going to try to be close and practical because I think this paper we are making should be more, let's go, practical, operative, or focus on operative tools than doctrinal, because our doctrine is known, of course, the two-fold approach and all that, and we're not going to move about it. I think the key point is to find an equilibrium. A moving and dynamic equilibrium we have always to find when we face this kind of topics. And I think that was exactly what Mr. de Kerkhoff was putting on the table permanently as a route. Yes. Do we want? Where are we now? Where are we going to be after the next coup of the terrorists? No? In this case, I'm going only to say 3 ideas. First of all, to make a condition and to make a priority of assessment of what has been done with the measures we had, before having any new measure, seems to me exaggerated. I don't feel, as it is written, I don't feel as supporting that, because if urgent and new measures can be taken, for instance, based on new technology possibilities, I think they should be taken, even if the assessment is in process. So I think it should be, the assessment cannot stop the urgency of some measure that democratically people ask of us. Once I say that, I am astonished that this assessment is not permanent. I think that the role is to evaluate permanently the efficiency and the updating of the measures that have been proposed. First of it. Secondly, I fully support the idea of, that have been taught by the lady, that when I hear things that, oh, look what happens after the 11th of September and the many maybe cutting of the rights, but at least very uncomfortable things we have to support. And it's not useful because, look at this, Madrid happens, London happens, Paris happens. I think it's absolutely mistaken. I am absolutely convinced that we owe a lot of security of the measures that have been taken. The key point is how many things we have avoided. I must say, I am astonished how many we have avoided with the facility nowadays the terrorists have to move. So I think the measures we have to put is, they are good guys, we have good systems, we have to improve them. We have loopholes important like the lack of exchange and information, but we're really protected. Our attitude cannot be, we are very angry because that doesn't work. That works. We have to make it better and to adapt to new situations. And this is a point that lacks in our message, in our paper that I dare propose. We have also to educate, inform honestly people of what's at stake, which are the real risks. We cannot treat them as irresponsible young babies and to say, well, the importance is not to make them fear, not to make them know the real threat. I don't think that's democratic. We have to speak to them that perfect protection is never reachable, but we are going to improve it, first things, but we have to educate people the situation we are and to get them as responsibility, to their responsibility, because they will help us to find the right equilibrium, because what they are going to cede on their fundamental right and whether they are going to understand the real strength of the threat and the measures. Third, and I finish, I think we have to be much more contendence on the European level we seek and we are looking for in this matter. Subsidiarity principle that I don't like at all, but that's a personal, cannot be an obstacle to recognize that all we are in this point absolutely European, with European systems, institutions, policies, anything that technicians will know. All we are Europeans, or simply when we are going against the citizens, against the humanity, not only against the idea of Europe, because we can only be effective building Europe and European citizenship, but also protecting them if we are aware that nowadays things are at continental level. Thank you.
Thank you. Before calling the next speaker, I really ask colleagues to be more concise. Otherwise, we will simply not finish at 12:30 and everybody has their engagements. I'm not going to set the time, but there's a clock on the wall so everybody can check for how long they're speaking. That's also a matter of courtesy to the colleagues because everybody wants to speak. Javier.
Gracias. Le quiero plantear muchas preguntas, pero le voy a preguntar al señor Verhofstadt solamente unas cuantas. La primera, el crimen organizado y el terrorismo tienen una logística que es la logística financiera. Y la logística financiera opera a través de los paraísos fiscales. Los paraísos fiscales siguen siendo discretamente tocados por la normativa internacional y la praxis, la práctica, no la teoría, la práctica, es que siguen siendo los canales fundamentales de financiación del crimen, de gestión financiera del crimen organizado y de los paraísos fiscales. ¿Qué es lo que debemos hacer o es que es tan importante los paraísos fiscales bajo el paraguas británico, por ejemplo, también bajo el paraguas holandés, para no ser tocados en absoluto. Segunda cuestión. Mire, yo no conozco ningún servicio secreto, ningún servicio de inteligencia, y tengo alguna práctica y algún conocimiento de ello, que borre de sus archivos ninguna información, aunque aparentemente sea relativamente interesante. Por lo tanto, cada vez que hablamos de garantías, como usted ha dicho, hay que crear todas las salvaguardias, ¿estamos hablando de la teoría para quedarnos tranquilos o estamos hablando de la práctica cuando conocemos todos que no hay servicio de información que borre sus datos, aunque sean relativamente interesantes? Y me refiero concretamente, por ejemplo, al PNR. Eso no se borra jamás, aunque tenga que ser teóricamente borrado. Es la práctica de los servicios de inteligencia hoy en toda Europa y mañana cuando tengamos el PNR. Y además, esto será parte de un tráfico con los diferentes servicios de inteligencia de otros países concernidos, con los que se tenga una práctica correcta de actuación, porque esto es como se actúa. Por lo tanto, mire, yo tengo una frase que es del quinto infierno de Dante, y es: perded toda esperanza vosotros que entráis. En consecuencia, por encima de la teoría está la práctica. Dígame usted si me equivoco. Deseo que me diga que me equivoco y que me dé algún ejemplo práctico de la realidad, no de que se borre aparentemente, sino que de realmente se borre. Tercera cuestión que quiero plantearle. El control de fronteras es interesante, es correcto, siempre que se llegue con un pasaporte. Pero cuando se llega sin pasaporte o con pasaportes falsificados o documentación falsificada, y después de que esta documentación falsificada les ha permitido el acceso, me estoy refiriendo a Ceuta y Melilla, donde sabe usted que se compra documentación falsa verdadera en territorio marroquí, con la que se accede al territorio Schengen, que es el territorio de Ceuta y Melilla. ¿Qué se tiene que hacer con las personas que entran o bien masivamente sin documentación, por la fuerza, o bien con documentación falsa? Si no hay una política efectiva de expulsión, la práctica es que se quedan en Europa y cuando se le quiere expulsar no hay manera porque ya no se sabe dónde están. Por lo tanto, si no hay una práctica efectiva de expulsiones, no llegamos a ninguna parte. Y la última. ¿Considera usted que el Parlamento Europeo es un objetivo de primer nivel para el terrorismo internacional? Y si considera usted que el Parlamento Europeo es uno de los mejores objetivos del terrorismo internacional en Europa, ¿está usted de acuerdo que el Parlamento Europeo es simultáneamente el mejor y más fácil objetivo del terrorismo internacional? Porque es que no existe ningún parlamento ni ninguna oficina pública en Europa que esté menos protegida que este Parlamento.
Can I remind you of the time? I'm sorry, but... Okay, next speaker, Maite.
Sí, muchísimas gracias. Primero agradecer este seminario y el documento. A mí me parece que el documento tiene las bases para poder trabajar de una manera muy potente. Ahora bien, una cosa es lo que pone el papel y otra cosa es que nos hagan caso para poder desarrollar todo lo que está en el documento que finalmente aprobemos. El documento es muy ambicioso y desarrollarlo requeriría una voluntad política y muchísimos recursos económicos. Una de las personas que ha intervenido ha hablado precisamente que en todos los temas de desradicalización y prevención está habiendo recortes de presupuestos. Tenemos un problema urgente, que es el tema de la seguridad, porque sin seguridad no tenemos libertad, pero tenemos una cuestión de largo alcance, y la cuestión de largo alcance no se puede ver solo desde el punto de vista de la información policial o de la lucha contraterrorista pura. En esa parte entra la cuestión de la prevención y de la desradicalización. Desde el punto de vista de la prevención, no estamos tan mal, porque en los días terribles que hemos sufrido con los franceses, la reacción emocional primaria de todos los europeos y especialmente de los franceses fue estupenda. Fue el principio de empatía, el je suis Charlie. Y desde el punto de vista político, los líderes europeos también actuaron correctamente. Se unieron todos e hicieron aquello que los políticos tienen que hacer, lanzar 2 o 3 ideas fundamentales y generar en la población una cierta sensación de seguridad, de que hay liderazgo. Eso funciona bien para el momento de urgencia. Ahora bien, si nos encontramos con terrorismo más repetido, en más focos, podríamos empezar a tener quiebras desde el punto de vista moral. Por tanto, cuando hablamos de prevención, no tenemos que pensar solo en la prevención específica con los colectivos que pueden ser vulnerables, sino en la prevención inespecífica de todos los chavales y todos los ciudadanos europeos. por una parte a nivel político, con los liderazgos que son oportunos, y por otra parte en el propio entorno escolar o no escolar, para que no haya reacciones violentas en sentido contrario. Este es uno de los principios de amenaza que tenemos y que no hemos evaluado suficientemente. La cuestión de que los chavales tienen todos la sangre caliente, todos pertenecen a la misma generación. A los chavales musulmanes se les está ofreciendo el éxito y el poder a través de la violencia, pero los otros chavales jóvenes que pertenecen a la misma generación tienen también sus problemas de identidad colectiva, de paro, etcétera, etcétera. Por tanto, comunidades resilientes, comunidades duras, comunidades que sepan aguantar los atentados es algo que tenemos que trabajar. Y en el Parlamento Europeo no tenemos competencias para diseñar currículums europeos, pero podemos recomendar a los países que hagan este tipo de trabajo, por una parte. Por otra parte, en prevención específica, en prevención específica necesitamos materiales específicos y buenas prácticas, pero RAN está muy poco desarrollado. Ha empezado hace 2 años en grupos de trabajo y no tiene fondos, no tiene una estructura para ello. La parte buena, desde los atentados de las Torres Gemelas, todo lo que tiene que ver con inteligencia, con seguridad, con los fallos que tenga, con lo que se pueda arreglar, está mejorando y está conectado. Pero la parte de prevención no. Es una parte muy, muy débil. El documento creo que es muy bueno y nos va a tocar muchísimo trabajo para hacer que esto se convierta en realidad, porque tampoco hay fondos.
Thank you. Pavel?
Good morning. We had a debate last night at the Bureau meeting as well. I can be really brief. One remark on the intelligence, which is a key point in the paper. I think that we will need, obviously, a political will, but in order to have a political will, we need to have the quality on the side of the services that are involved. And that will be a major, I would say, bottleneck, because there is a lack of trust, and the trust has been already mentioned, and sometimes it is for good reasons. I think the paper is very good, and I would very much propose that this is not a one-shot event, but that we continue, we keep a high profile on that, and I think that sometime in the future, and the debate proved the need for that, we should have a debate probably in camera with people that are working with some sensitive information. 2 remarks and questions at the same time. The paper, as comprehensive as it is, I think should probably, and that's also a question to the coordinator, should deal with the internal security of the EU institutions. I think we can be ambitious, but at a time when we have security risks inside the institutions, when we have people employed that did not pass security clearance in the member states, this is a serious issue, and I wonder whether this is somehow being addressed. The second point which I wanted to mention, and also would appreciate a comment on that, would you find the mechanisms and the instruments that we have on exchange of information, on sharing and common effort in the area of illegal arms trafficking to be sufficient? Because if we look at it, many of the armed conflicts beyond the borders of the EU are basically fought with European arms, including my own country. And also some of the terrorist attacks that have been conducted in recent weeks, also years, again, are arms. And if we look at some of the cases, the But case, for example, but also his close associates in Poland and so on, and how some key position people in intelligence outside the framework of the EU, but not outside the NATO framework, are involved, I think this is a serious issue. So I wonder whether you would have a comment on that, what you would perceive that what should be the path to take in this respect. Thank you.
Thank you. Gaia?
Thank you, and thank you for your presentations. I have a question to Mrs. Aikman regarding the content of internet. You said that we should better detect content on the internet with special units. But my question is, what would be the European legal framework, considering that member states have very different rules for freedom of speech, and how it is that we can ensure that the balance is still respected and checks and balances are in place between surveillance, security, and freedom of speech and privacy? Thank you.
Thank you also for being very brief. Marielle?
Merci beaucoup, Sophie. Je voudrais rebondir sur ce que M. De Kerkhove a dit tout à l'heure sur le contrôle des frontières. Et je pense qu'il faut qu'on fasse très attention tous ensemble. On ne peut pas laisser dire que le contrôle systématique aux frontières de Schengen n'aurait pas d'utilité ni d'efficacité tant que le SIS ne serait pas parfaitement renseigné. D'abord, je crois que ce serait une erreur de le penser. En plus, sur le plan politique, il y a des moments où il faut pouvoir affirmer que nous sommes en capacité de contrôler systématiquement nos frontières extérieures. Je pense que si on veut préserver Schengen à l'avenir, il faut montrer que Schengen, ça peut être efficace, d'autant plus si on veut couper l'herbe sous le pied de tous ceux qui veulent revenir aux frontières nationales, et je vous assure qu'il y en a beaucoup dans tous nos pays et dans tous les États membres. Alors moi, je vous en supplie, allons au contraire sur l'idée qu'il faut renforcer Schengen, qu'il faut montrer à nos concitoyens que Schengen, ça marche, que Schengen, ça fonctionne. Et je pense que le Conseil européen, il devrait prendre une décision, c'est effectivement le contrôle systématique aux frontières de Schengen, terrestres, maritimes et aériennes. Alors après, bien sûr qu'il faut, sur le moyen terme, renseigner le SIS le mieux possible. On connaît tous les problèmes de partage des informations de services renseignement. Ils ont toujours peur de brûler une information. Il faut définir le niveau de partage. Tout ça, c'est complexe. Vous connaissez ça absolument par cœur. Mais sur le plan politique, il va falloir annoncer que nous sommes en capacité de faire un contrôle systématique de nos frontières. Deuxième chose, je pense que nous devons réfléchir à nos relations avec des pays comme la Turquie et que nous devons entamer une collaboration avec ces pays-là. Tout le monde sait que la Turquie est le couloir d'accès à la Syrie. J'y suis allée il y a 1 an avec Nathalie, nous étions à la frontière syrienne, c'est très facile de pénétrer et de rentrer en Syrie par la frontière turco-syrienne. Moi, je me demande s'il ne faut pas, peut-être ça va vous faire tous bondir, mais en accord avec la Turquie, ça ne peut se faire qu'en collaboration avec eux. Mais pourquoi pas rétablir une sorte de visa provisoire ou temporaire entre l'espace Schengen, la Turquie, ou la Turquie et l'espace Schengen. Ce sont des points, en tous les cas, qu'à mon avis, il faut mettre sur la table.
Merci. José?
Thanks, Sophie. Well, just want to make a quick remark, very short. We talk about external threats. We talk about Schengen, borders, etc. But I think more than that, it's an internal problem. It's nowadays, the modern terrorism is homeland, is created here within our borders. And I think we forget this. It's going to come up, it's going to pop up all around Europe. And it's not from outside factors, it's within our borders. I think we have to tackle problems within the local communities, take together different religions, different minorities, and get them all together and make dialogues with them. I think that's the way to do it. I believe at the moment that's what we should do. Thank you.
Thank you. Hans?
I think the most vital, most basic right is the right to live in freedom without fear. So if there is an exceptional threat to this basic right, exceptional measures are acceptable. However, if you compare, Mr. de Kerkhoven, your information and what you shared with us, and also Mrs. Eijkman, there is a difference. My interpretation is that Mrs. Eijkman says the situation is manageable, and I get more the impression that you say extra measures are necessary. So how big is the threat and how different is it from 1, 2, 3 years ago? Or are we that successful that we have prevented so many of these terrorist attacks? Second question, and I end, is indeed we need to have an exchange of information. You yourself said then you have to be able to trust each other. This is not a bureaucratic process. This is, are the 28, or there are more than 28 secret services in the EU, can you trust them all? You don't need to name names, but can you trust them all? Because if you indeed if you don't trust an agency, you don't exchange information. What Brussels says, what the national capital says, you don't do it, because it will cost lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans. I'll allow Jean to intervene as well, even if he didn't signal before.
Pardonne-moi, Sophie, mais j'avais demandé la parole et tu ne m'avais pas vu. C'est vrai que ce n'est pas simple de concilier sécurité et liberté. Et alors, je voudrais poser une question à monsieur de Kerkhove, parce que s'il n'y a pas la confiance, je pense que ça ne peut pas fonctionner. Et en l'état, est-ce que vous avez le sentiment, Monsieur de Kerkhoff, que les États membres de l'Union européenne participent avec la même ardeur, avec la même détermination et avec la même confiance? Je trouve que le papier qui nous est proposé est excellent. Cela étant, comme Gérard Depré, est-ce qu'il faut créer une nouvelle institution? Car on a créé beaucoup d'institutions. On a Frontex, on a un certain Europol. Bon, est-ce que chacune de ces institutions fonctionne bien? Dans certains domaines, il me semble qu'on est dans l'illusoire pratiquement, et que, aux yeux de nos concitoyens, on expose l'Europe dans des conditions assez dangereuses. Car si ça ne fonctionne pas, c'est l'Europe qui est mise en accusation. Et la tentation est tellement forte de revenir à des dispositions d'ordre national que l'on se trouve en vraie difficulté. Marielle a évoqué l'espace Schengen, mais l'espace Schengen, je n'ai pas l'impression qu'il y ait confiance entre les États. Et il y a des béances dans le dispositif. Donc on ne peut pas continuer de cette façon. Avez-vous le sentiment, Monsieur de Kerkhoff, que l'on peut continuer ainsi si il n'y a pas de la part des États une franche détermination de revoir la gouvernance de l'espace qui se considère comme véritablement solidaire? S'il n'y a pas, car au fond l'Europe n'a pas de pilote. Ce matin j'écoutais un grand opérateur des télécommunications. L'Europe c'est un peu n'importe quoi, c'est 100 opérateurs, lorsqu'aux États-Unis il y a 4 opérateurs et un régulateur. On parle de fiscalité et Madame Harding, qui représente Google, c'est bien ce qu'est l'Europe pour les géants du GAFA, c'est-à-dire qu'on peut opérer en Europe sans payer d'impôts pratiquement, compte tenu de la concurrence qui existe entre les Européens eux-mêmes. Donc, n'y a-t-il pas nécessité aujourd'hui, et au fond l'opinion publique qui a été tellement émue par les événements tragiques récents, n'est-elle pas prête à entendre un discours pour plus de fédéralisme et des transferts francs de compétences entre les États membres qui perpétuent une illusion de souveraineté? Ne faut-il pas aller vers un vrai partage de puissance pour qu'elle soit effective?
Thank you. Unless there are any last burning issues, no, then I'll use the opportunity to put my own questions in. First of all, to Mr. de Kerkhoven, you say you go by the motto, don't let a good crisis go to waste. I would share that motto. At the same time, I would also say, let's not rush through legislation which turns out to be sloppy work, like the Data Retention Directive that was adopted under very similar circumstances. We need a lot more evidence and a lot more facts. I feel it is our duty as parliamentarians and liberals and Democrats to do evidence-based lawmaking and not assumption-based lawmaking. And in the emotional climate of these days, there is the tendency of doing assumption-based lawmaking. Second remark about the impossibility of information sharing. Quite frankly, I find that very, very hard to accept, because would that mean that we're going to adopt more symbolic measures that only give us fake security or partial security only because we accept that security services refuse to cooperate? The security services are at the service of the people, not the other way around. And quite frankly, they also have a few things to answer for. You know, we've seen in recent years that they run off track, and I think it would be beneficial for our security and our democratic rule of law if we bring them back within the legal framework. So I do think that we need to insist a lot more and not just wait until they trust each other or they want to share information. Of course they don't want to share information. It's against human nature. Everybody likes their own institution, and information is power. Of course they don't want to share it, so we need to put some pressure on it, and I would not be opposed to mandatory information sharing. Finally, on internet surveillance, and in particular what you advocate, an encryption ban. In other words, it's like, you know, banning people, making it a criminal offense to have a lock on your front door, and then say, but within the full respect of the privacy rights, I don't see any privacy rights left there. And then even if you, and I've been told by the technical people who know a lot more than me, that it's actually not true what you said, that even with a court order, it would not be possible to get the key and actually enter into the communications of a person. It is not necessary to have a global ban on encryption. You know, what does that mean to our democracy if politicians, lawyers, journalists, NGOs, whistleblowers, doctors, if they cannot have secure communications anymore? Do you really feel comfortable to know that, say, Mr. Orban would ban encryption and that NGOs and journalists and lawyers, you know, cannot communicate freely anymore? Would you really feel comfortable? I don't, frankly. So I think that goes way too far. We should look at targeted measures. Thank you. Now I'm going to invite the three speakers to reply in the inverse order, or from left to right, rather. And you have 5 minutes each for response and concluding remarks. So first, Mrs. Eijkman.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your questions. I have a limited number of questions I feel I'm capable of responding to. Maybe the first gentleman, which I only got his first name, Enrique. I think one of the good things that you mentioned in terms of educating and being honest, there's a second thing, and it's more in relationship to what was said by my colleague, Ms. Verding, earlier. I think we should not only train decision makers in being honest about what risks are, but I think we should also train them on about how cyberspace works and technology. I give many lectures on counterterrorism and privacy, and almost always youngsters come up to me and they say, help me, my boss doesn't understand what he or she needs to decide upon. And I think that is something that we can, we should definitely include, and I urge you to enter in that debate. The second point is, in terms of responses of politicians and suggestions that are now being made in the context of the European Union, I think politicians sometimes also act maybe a little bit irrational in terms of what they think that they're proposing measures, that what they think that the public wants to hear. If you ever heard and read the work of Mark Elgerdes, The Drama Democracy, I think that is something that we should take into consideration as well. And I think more research or more of a poll of what people exactly want would help. In terms of the question that was directed to me in terms of the content of internet, let me correct myself if I said something wrong. I'm not a big fan of monitoring of the content on internet myself, but I'm realistic enough that there are proposals lying there in terms of counterterrorism that they're there. And I think if you're asking me a question in the context of a European legal framework, I want to say two things. First of all, there's of course the Charter of Fundamental Rights, and I understand that the freedom of expression is organized differently in different countries. My point is this, and this is where Europe can make a difference. Common standards or a suggestion of a judicial authority that monitorizes or at least gives a standard on how the content of internet should be evaluated would help, because in practice it's now up to companies like Google's to do so. There are not really that many common standards, and that's what I'm worried about. Who is going to judge what is a threat or not in terms of freedom of speech? And I think the European Union can play a role in terms of advocating that at least this decision should be subjected to judicial review, for instance, etc. So maybe it's not so much on the content of the law, but it is in the enforcement or implementation structures. In terms of the external versus internal threats, I agree that we should definitely focus also on the internal problems, but then also not look just at the majority or the dominant view. All of us are Je suis Charlie, but I think after a couple of days after the attacks, we had some interviews in the international press also about people in the banlieues or in minority areas maybe who had different points of view, and let's also be open to those points of view. In terms of Mr. Van Balen's remarks, I agree there's also a right to security. I understand that, and obviously states and governments have to can take sometimes maybe even temporary measures to deal with it. I'm not saying I don't think I'm an expert in terms of, and I don't want to suggest and leave here to say that the situation is manageable. I am not a counterterrorism executive, but I do want us to be realistic in terms of the threat and this idea that each and every person who is going to Syria is immediately a threat to us. That is just not true. It's not true. Let's be realistic and try to inform also the political and public debate about it. In terms of what Sophie Innetveld was saying, I just wanted to say in relation to add something in terms of her question to Mr. Gilles de Kerkhoff in terms of internet surveillance and the encryption ban. One of the things I'm very worried about is this issue of fair trial, and if people are forced to give up certain information, that information is inevitably going to be used in criminal trials against persons. And I think from a national security perspective, I understand that it's necessary, but there's also such a thing as the right to a fair trial. So what are the guarantees then if you have to give up information that will not be used against you? And this is a real-time issue. Many times in my country, when people return now from Syria, they immediately have an interview with the police. And if you want to cooperate, that's great, but that information can be also used against you in a criminal trial. Last but not least, encryption also helps many human rights defenders across the world to communicate. And those same people in Syria who are posting things on YouTube, they also use secure messages to share a lot of information with us, and I'm scared of the slippery slope. Once you give this up, what is next? But maybe on the other hand, Mr. de Kerkhoff has more to say about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Harding.
Thank you. I think I'll just respond to the questions that I feel qualified to do so. And I think the main point here is what a few people have said actually, and what my colleague has said, is that the evidence base here really needs improving, especially in regards to the content online and how that affects people. So I think evidence and education about, for companies, just as much as anybody else, about, what role social media plays in the radicalization journey. I don't know if we have a concrete answer to that. So I'd say, to inform policymakers such as yourselves making decisions about what should stay up, what should come down, what should be against the law, the different freedom of speech standards across countries across the globe that were referred to. I think evidence in terms of what actually has an effect and when, if at all, is really important, as well as the education component that we talked about.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. de Kerkhoff, your final.
Yeah, thank you. I'll answer in a telegraphic way. First, the first intervention there was not much question, but more statement, and I fully agree with the three of them. We should sometimes accept to take new measures. The ideal world is, of course, fully evidence-based, but when people converge on the need of something, sometimes you need to do that because you need to act. The second one, clearly, I don't want to suggest that we haven't done anything since 9/11. Indeed, our service has improved a lot. Stovepipes have been removed, and many plots have been foiled. 20, as I understand, in recent years. Cells have been dismantled, and people have been prevented to go to Syria and Iraq, for instance, because we want to protect them in the first place, protect the families and protect society. So we are not so bad, let's say, and I fully agree. Unfortunately, there is nothing like 100% security. If we want to have 100% security, we should go for a big brother society, and that's something we don't want. And subsidiarity should not prevent us from... There is not only terrorism, frankly, there are big powers in the world which are investing so much in intelligence, in spying, in cyber attack. I don't want to mention in a public setting some countries, but they have already infiltrated the most sophisticated critical infrastructure in a sleeping virus. They know how to handle that in case of and when they would like to use it. We should build an EU response. As a Belgian, and like Obelix, I fell in the magic potion of integration when I was a child. So of course, I think we need to do that as quickly as possible. I don't have any answer to the question as to whether the European Parliament is sufficiently well protected, hopefully I'm not in charge of this, and the same applies to the Council and the Commission. People are working on it, but that implies Belgian support. But I'm more than happy to help the Secretary General of whom I met recently of the European Parliament to improve this, of course. Prevention, yes, we need to do much more. I think I said when I started working, in fact, I spent the first years of my mandate on non-security related policies. Push the Commission to invest on prevent. It took me 5 years, and I can give you, tell you how sometimes difficult it was. Same for the member states. If I take a country like France, it's very impressive to see that in the last 2 years, a country like France, which had not invested in prevention, at the initiative of Manuel Valls first and Bernard Cazeneuve then, has done a lot, and they've tasked a prefect to make a tour of Europe to identify the best practices, and that's what was used in Bernard Cazeneuve's plan for stemming the flow of foreign fighters. It is very impressive, and I welcome that. So this sort of collecting best practice helps a lot, and our member states are doing what they can to speed up their investment on that, but I do agree, much more needs to be done. Your suggestion, Monsieur Telika, to have a debate in camera with security people, I think this is much needed in this institution. We don't have that. I can do my best, but I'm not operational. I'm not dealing with threat on a daily basis. So you should have more meetings with the people who are on the ground facing the threat and assess then if they are just completely excessive or not, and the nature of the risk. Sometimes it's eye-opening exercise, not just because they want to have more budget and more staff. Illegal arms trafficking, fully in full agreement. We've started we have a very complicated system we call the policy cycle for the COSI, internal security. We have an impact project on arms trafficking. Only 13 member states are part of it. We should have the 28. Yes, in it. The question as to whether we need a legal framework to define what is illegal or not illegal content on internet, I'm pragmatic. I think as a first step, I would favor more a system which signal to the big companies content which is not consistent with their terms and conditions, which already would improve a lot the removal of content we don't like. But we can contemplate the legislation, but I suspect it will be an awfully complicated exercise. 7, je suis tout à fait d'accord avec Marie Le Sarney. J'ai du mal m'exprimer parce que dans toutes mes positions, dans toutes mes interviews, dans tous mes documents, dans celui qui est sur State Watch, je demande qu'on prenne tout de suite une mesure pour modifier le code Schengen, même si ça sera dans 3 ans, même si ça sera au terme d'un débat très compliqué avec le Parlement européen. Je pense qu'en plus de ce qu'il faut faire tout de suite, il faut entamer ce travail, parce que comme vous, je crains, comme la peste, 3 némouches qui rentrent dans l'Union européenne non détectées, qui commettent des attentats et qui amènent les plus populistes de nos hommes politiques à demander la réinstauration des contrôles aux frontières intérieures, ce qui serait une régression européenne colossale. Bon. Et donc, je pense que la meilleure manière de protéger une des plus belles réalisations de l'intégration européenne, c'est effectivement d'affiner le dispositif et de prévoir ce que vous avez dit. Je suis 100% d'accord. Sur la Turquie, moi j'ai beaucoup été en Turquie depuis 2 ans, j'ai essayé de développer des relations de confiance. C'est un pays, ce serait trop long de le développer, qui a lui-même pas mal de défis. Ils sont quand même à la porte de l'enfer. Ils ont aussi des attentats qui viennent de Daesh. Ils ont 1,5 million de réfugiés. Et nous cherchons à les avoir avec nous dans une coopération commune. Pas simplement de mettre la Turquie dans le coin en accusant la Turquie. De bonne foi, les Turcs nous disent, écoutez, c'est bien gentil, mais vous pourriez peut-être arrêter vos types avant qu'ils viennent chez nous, in the first place, avant de nous demander de faire le boulot. Bon. Donc nous, on doit aussi être plus performants, et eux aussi. Et il y a tout un plan. Vous avez parlé de visa, c'est intéressant parce que lors de ma dernière réunion avec le ministre de l'Intérieur, je me suis rendu compte qu'un des leviers que nous avons avec la Turquie, puisque l'actuelle Commission n'a pas de perspective de grand progrès sur l'adhésion en tant que telle, c'est la libéralisation des visas. C'est une demande forte de la Turquie. Et si vous regardez les rapports de la Commission sur la préparation de la libération des visas, ça fait appel à un certain nombre de mesures préalables qui nous aideront aussi sur les combattants étrangers. Et donc je pense que le message que j'essaie de faire passer à nos amis turcs, c'est qu'il faut accélérer sur ce plan-là aussi. The threat, no time to develop the threat, I'm afraid, but I would say it's just more complex. I would not want to suggest it's 10 times more serious than on the direct aftermath of 9/11, but if you have three sources, i.e. EU citizens with no contact with terrorist organization and not traveling abroad, but just getting radicalized in prison, on internet, in interaction with radical preachers, a first set of people. The second one, the 3,000 plus foreign fighters, terrorist fighters, and the last one, which I'm sometimes criticized when I say that, but I think Al-Qaeda is in the defensive, and they see Daesh as the growing winner of the competition for the global jihad, and they may want to mount an attack just to show to the world that they are still relevant. And so they are still looking for clean skin, not the color of the skin, but clean skin, the people not known by the security service, having valid document and able to enter the EU. I don't suggest it will happen. I just say we have to be more subtle and adapt the tools. The trust, is it that I'm not the one who have to assess if there is trust? I think it's trust among the service. It's not me trusting them or not. I think they do their best. But that leads me to say something which is aussi une réponse à M. Arthuis. Je pense que la meilleure chose qu'on peut faire aujourd'hui, c'est d'encourager les États membres à avoir des services de renseignement du XXIe siècle. La France est en train de le faire. C'est assez impressionnant. D'ailleurs, je trouve que c'est évidemment une certaine... c'est très triste ce qui s'est passé à Paris, compte tenu du fait que la France est un des pays d'Europe qui investit le plus dans son dispositif de renseignement. Il y a un responsable du renseignement à l'Élysée, la DCRI est en train d'être transformée en DGSI, avec le recrutement de 430 personnes, avec un changement de profil pour ne pas avoir des policiers uniquement, mais des psychologues, des sociologues, des linguistes, des ingénieurs informaticiens. Donc d'affiner aussi, parce que je pense que, et je pense là-dessus, je suis d'accord avec Sophie Inhotveld, c'est qu'on doit enrichir l'analyse. Au-delà simplement de collecter plus, c'est qu'on a peut-être une tendance à avoir simplement une analyse de policiers qui est... Et donc, mais tous les États ne font pas cet effort. Tous les États ne font pas l'effort d'investir dans leurs services de renseignement. Et l'expérience montre que si chacun élève son niveau de performance, ils partageront plus ensemble. Parce que l'asymétrie entre les services est aussi un frein à l'échange d'informations. Les béances de Schengen, c'est pour ça que j'ai dit, je répondais à Marie Le Sarney en disant qu'il faut effectivement continuer en permanence à affiner le dispositif. To the last two questions of Sophie, we should not rush for legislation. True. I think no one will challenge that statement, and we need more evidence-based. Yes, it's what we expect from the Commission when they prepare legislation, not based on assumption, but the world is imperfect, I'm afraid. And if I quote the sentence of Rahm Emanuel, it's because we need both leadership and sometimes overcome a natural trend of people to be scared by changes. And if you don't use the political momentum sometime, you just lost the momentum and it will not repeat. And we need to build a more integrated Europe in this field, because I'm convinced it will lead to more security, but also more freedom as well. And therefore, if we just wait to have the perfect evidence-based report, ideally you're right, and we should strive for it and go more for it. But you know, 9/11, there was. I'm not saying that because Mr. Verhofstadt invites me, but it was true leadership. The European arrest warrant would not have been adopted in the way it was if Mr. Verhofstadt had not convened at least 3 times the heads of state and government on minor stuff. But in Brussels, when there is clear leadership, believe me, the system works. The people do what... But when they don't have a clear leadership and a clear line, the system remains a bit loose. I don't agree with your other statement that the security service refused to cooperate. They do, but they don't want to use to work in an EU framework, and that was the consequence was Article 4 that I mentioned before. But they work a lot asymmetrically. I do agree among themselves, but they do. The head of the security service are not crazy. When you feel the heat of the threat, you will not take the risk just to refrain from sharing. They will lose their job. And the third one, I'm afraid, I don't agree either on an encryption ban. That's not what I'm saying. Of course, we need to protect NGOs. The Arab Spring has been made possible thanks to Twitter. It's a major ingredient of the Arab Spring. So we should protect. We know too well how much, and I don't want to quote country, we know too well that we have to protect people for fighting for freedom and speech. But it's not my point. My point is, in genuine democracy and on the basis of a legal framework, it should remain possible for the authorized people, i.e., most of the time the police on the basis of a warrant of a judge, to listen to the conversation of crooks. Otherwise, you may at some stage have an ideal world of people free to say what they want, but with a development of a criminality which is worrying. And I will share with you, I'm preparing this, technology allows now, because it's decentralized, it will not be possible even for the companies, the GAFA company, even to get access to the content that they provide, technology speaking. Even the NSA with the biggest computers in the world. And it's not a coincidence if the head of GCHQ, that is the British NSA, and I think they have sophisticated tool, raised the problem and rang the alarm, saying, hey, we have to have this discussion. But it's a choice that the Parliament has to do. If you prefer to protect completely by encryption conversation and not allowing the police in legitimate cases to get access, that's a choice. I just raised your attention onto this. On evidence, what you said on evidence, well, we are in a rule of law state. If the police collect illegally any information, it will not be used in court. We still have judges who can consider that an evidence has been illegally collected. That happens very often. So let's beef up the procedural safeguards, but that's not a reason for not allowing interception. I know we won't agree here, but I think I stop at this stage.
Okay, thank you all very much for your input and your patience. To the colleagues on the paper, we will discuss it and hopefully adopt it next week in our group meeting on Tuesday, I believe. Yep. And I would ask everybody to submit their written proposals for amendments by Friday evening this week, so we can actually integrate them. Thank you all very much.